My son sold the house and kicked me out in the middle of a blinding snowstorm. He thought I had nothing left. I walked away without saying a word. But the next morning his phone would not stop ringing. And when he found out the truth, it was already too late. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace, and let us dive into exactly how I made them pay. I am Clarence Montgomery, though everyone in the city calls me Clay. I am 72 years old, and for 35 years I served as the Director of City Zoning for the City of Chicago. I navigated the most brutal, corrupt, and cutthroat political landscapes in the country. But to my son Darius and his wife Vanessa, I was just a relic. I always wore a faded, heavy puffer jacket and drove a beat-up, rusted Chevy truck. I never flashed my money. I let them think I was just a tired old black man surviving on a modest city pension, a man who was quietly fading away into irrelevance. They thought I was a burden. They were dead wrong. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in late January. A Category 3 blizzard was actively ripping through Chicago, burying the streets in heavy, blinding snow. The wind blowing off Lake Michigan was howling, dropping the wind chill down to -15 degrees, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes it hard to breathe. I was standing on the front porch of the house I bought 40 years ago, watching the heavy oak front door swing violently open. My daughter-in-law Vanessa stood in the doorway, blocking the heat from inside. She was 33 years old, a white woman who owned a high-end boutique wellness spa in the city. She lived her entire life, completely wrapped in a bubble of unearned entitlement, and she always looked at me like I was a stain on her expensive hardwood floors. She did not say hello. She did not ask if I was freezing. She just heaved 2 heavy black plastic garbage bags out onto the snow-covered porch. They landed at my feet with a dull, heavy thud. The plastic ripped open slightly, exposing my winter boots, a few of my old sweaters, and the framed photograph of my late wife, Beatrice. "You need to leave, Clay," Vanessa said. Her voice was just as sharp and cold as the winter wind. "We sold the house. The closing was finalized this afternoon. A cash buyer made an incredible offer that we simply could not refuse, and we have to hand over the keys completely vacant by tomorrow morning. So grab your garbage and go." Her words hit me much harder than the freezing storm. We sold the house. This was a 4-bedroom brick colonial in Hyde Park. My wife Beatrice and I bought this house 4 decades ago when the banks barely wanted to approve a mortgage for a young black couple. We poured our blood, our sweat, and our tears into this foundation. Beatrice planted the oak tree in the front yard. We raised Darius inside these walls. Beatrice took her last breath in the master bedroom upstairs 4 years ago. Every single corner of this property held the ghost of the woman I loved more than life itself. But legally, in the cold eyes of the law, Vanessa was right. 2 years ago, Darius had come to me with a thick folder full of legal documents. He played the role of the concerned, highly educated son perfectly. He sat at my kitchen table and told me that estate taxes and probate courts were going to completely wipe out my legacy when I passed away. He begged me to transfer the deed of the house into his name to protect the asset. I trusted him. I signed the paperwork because a father is supposed to trust his only child. I thought I was securing his future. I had no idea I was signing my own eviction notice. I looked past Vanessa, peering into the warm, brightly lit hallway of my own home. Darius was standing there. He is 36 years old, a man who always wanted the fast track to wealth but never wanted to put in the grueling hours to actually earn it. He was standing in the warmth of the foyer with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive cashmere cardigan. He would not make eye contact with me. He just stared down at the floor, perfectly content to let his wife do the dirty work. "Say something, Darius," I said. My voice was incredibly low and remarkably steady, cutting right through the howling wind. "You are throwing your 72-year-old father out into a Category 3 blizzard. At least look me in the eye and tell me why." Darius finally stepped forward, moving slowly past his wife, but he still refused to meet my gaze. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single crumpled $100 bill. He reached his hand out into the freezing cold and shoved the money toward my chest. "Just take a taxi to a motel downtown," Dad Darius muttered. His voice was trembling with pathetic, undeniable cowardice. "Vanessa is under a lot of stress right now. Her wellness spa is drowning in operational debt. The venture capital investors are breathing down her neck. We need the liquid cash from this property sale to save her business and clear our personal loans. You have your city pension. You can figure something out. But we need you out tonight so the professional cleaning crew can come in at dawn." I looked down at the $100 bill shaking in his hand. $100. That was the exact value my only son placed on my survival. He was willing to let me freeze to death on the icy streets of Chicago so his entitled wife could pay off her failing luxury business. He had stolen my home, desecrated his mother's memory, and now he was tossing me a scrap of paper like I was a beggar panhandling at a red light. Vanessa crossed her arms over her chest, shivering slightly in the doorway, clearly annoyed that I had not disappeared yet. "Just take the money and leave, Clay," she snapped impatiently, rolling her eyes. "Do not make a scene. You are not on the deed anymore. If you refuse to step off my property, I will not hesitate to call the police and have you forcefully removed for trespassing. I am not going to let you ruin our financial future just because you are too stubborn to move into an assisted living facility where you belong." I stood there on the frozen porch. The snow was blowing violently around us, catching in my gray beard and covering the shoulders of my old jacket. Any other father might have screamed. Any other man might have fallen to his knees, begged for mercy, or cried about the profound injustice of it all. I felt a fleeting urge to grab him by the collar and shake some sense into him. But 35 years of navigating the ruthless, cutthroat political landscape of Chicago City zoning had taught me one absolute, undeniable rule. You never show your enemy your cards, and you never negotiate with a parasite. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I reached out and took the $100 bill from Darius. I looked at the green paper for a brief second. Then I slowly opened my fingers and let the freezing wind catch it. The bill fluttered away instantly, swallowed by the darkness and the blinding snow. Darius flinched, finally looking up at my face in shock. He expected to see a broken, helpless old man crying for shelter. Instead, he saw an absolute predator. I reached down, picked up my heavy ring of keys, and turned my back on them. I did not take the garbage bags full of my clothes. I did not say goodbye. I walked down the icy driveway toward my beat-up, rusted Chevy parked on the street. Behind me, I heard the heavy oak door slam shut, the deadbolt clicking loudly into place. The sound was supposed to be the definitive end of my life. They truly thought they had just locked a poor old man out in the cold with absolutely nothing to his name. I opened the creaking door of my truck, climbed into the freezing cabin, and turned the ignition. The heavy engine roared to life. I shifted into gear and drove away into the whiteout. They thought I had nowhere to go. They had absolutely no idea that I was driving straight to my luxury penthouse at the very top of the apex tower in the center of the city, and they had absolutely no idea that the wealthy cash buyer who had just purchased this house for $1.2 million was a shell company owned entirely by me. The slaughter was about to begin. I sat in the driver's seat of my beat-up Chevy truck as the Category 3 blizzard battered the windshield. The heater was barely working, blowing a weak stream of lukewarm air against the freezing Chicago winter. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles ached. Outside, the snow was falling so heavily it looked like a solid white wall swallowing the house I had just been kicked out of, the house where I had spent 40 years of my life. My phone started vibrating violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my daughter-in-law, Vanessa. The message read, "Do not even think about calling the police and making a scene, old man. You are not on the deed anymore. Accept the truth and move on." I stared at those words for a long moment. The absolute audacity of this woman was staggering. She truly believed she had won. She thought she had outsmarted a helpless senior citizen and discarded him like a bag of trash in the snow. She thought she was untouchable. I did not text her back. I did not call my son to scream or beg. I simply pressed the power button, locked the screen, and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I shifted the truck into drive. The old tires spun for a second on the icy road before catching grip. I slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving the Hyde Park neighborhood behind me in the rearview mirror. Darius and Vanessa thought I was driving into the abyss. They thought I was heading south to find some cheap rundown motel, counting my meager pennies to pay for a room that smelled of stale smoke and desperation. They assumed I would be shivering in the dark, crying over my lost home. But I was not driving south. I merged onto the empty, snow-covered highway and headed straight for the gleaming, towering skyline of downtown Chicago. For 35 years, I served as the director of city zoning. I knew every single inch of this city. I knew where the multi-million-dollar developments were going to be built a decade before the developers even bought the land. People looked at me and saw a quiet civil servant pushing papers in a municipal building. They saw a black man who kept his head down and did his job. But you do not control the zoning and commercial planning of the third largest city in America without learning exactly how real wealth is created, moved, and concealed. While my son Darius was out trying to look wealthy by leasing expensive cars and buying designer clothes he could not afford, I was quietly buying up premium commercial real estate through blind trusts. I let them think I was a modest pensioner living on a fixed income because I wanted to see who they truly were. I wanted to see how they would treat me when they thought I had absolutely nothing to offer them. And tonight, they had shown me their true colors. I pulled my rusty truck up to the sleek, ultra-modern glass tower known as the Apex. It was the most exclusive and heavily guarded residential building in the entire financial district. The valet, wrapped in a heavy winter coat, rushed out into the blizzard. He did not give my beat-up vehicle a strange look. He did not treat me like I did not belong. He opened my door with absolute respect. "Good evening, Mr. Montgomery," he said politely over the howling wind. "Terrible weather out there tonight, sir." "Thank you, David," I replied, handing him a crisp $50 bill. "Keep the heater running for a bit." I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the massive, pristine marble lobby. The warmth of the building enveloped me instantly. The concierge gave me a respectful nod as I walked past the main elevator banks. I approached a single unmarked steel door at the end of the corridor, the private lift. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a thick, solid black keycard. I swiped it against the hidden scanner. The heavy steel doors glided open silently. I stepped inside and the elevator shot up past 60 floors, bypassing everyone else, taking me straight to the crown jewel of the entire building, the penthouse. The doors opened into a sprawling 6,000 square foot sanctuary of glass, steel, and imported dark wood. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the blizzard burying the city below. The storm that was supposed to kill me was now just a silent, beautiful movie playing outside my window. I took off my snowy puffer jacket and laid it over an expensive Italian leather sofa. I walked straight down the long, gallery-style hallway and entered my master's study. The room was lined with thick books, architectural blueprints, and financial ledgers. I moved a heavy bronze sculpture on the bookshelf, revealing a biometric scanner hidden in the wall. I pressed my thumb against the glowing green glass. A hidden steel safe clicked heavily and swung open. Inside that safe were not just stacks of emergency cash. There were property deeds, trust fund portfolios, holding company documents. It was the physical proof of my true life's work. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, freshly printed legal folder. It was the real estate closing documents for the house in Hyde Park. The very house I had just been evicted from 2 hours ago. Vanessa had gloated to my face on the front porch. She had bragged about a wealthy cash buyer making an incredible above-market offer they simply could not refuse. $1.2 million paid in full with a wire transfer scheduled to clear first thing tomorrow morning. She needed that money desperately to save her failing wellness spa and pay off the mountain of debt she and my son had secretly accumulated. I opened the folder and flipped to the final page. I looked at the buyer signature line. The purchasing entity was listed as Blue Oak LLC. Blue Oak LLC. It was named after the massive oak tree my late wife Beatrice had planted in the front yard of that exact house 40 years ago on the very day we moved in. I am the sole proprietor, president, and controlling shareholder of Blue Oak LLC. I bought my own house. I was the wealthy, mysterious cash buyer who had bailed them out of their financial ruin. They were so incredibly desperate to get their hands on $1 million that they never bothered to have their lawyers thoroughly investigate the shell company making the offer. They saw the zeros on the contract, they saw the promise of immediate cash, and they blindly signed away the deed. They thought they were selling my legacy to a faceless corporation. They had no idea they were handing the keys directly back to me. I walked over to my personal bar and poured myself a glass of neat bourbon. I stood by the massive glass window, taking a slow sip as the amber liquid warmed my chest. I looked down at the frozen, chaotic streets of Chicago. Tomorrow morning, Darius and Vanessa were expecting a life-changing wire transfer to hit their bank account. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. They thought they had successfully discarded a useless old man, wiped their hands clean of their responsibilities, and walked away rich. They were probably celebrating right now, drinking expensive wine and packing their bags. But I control the wire transfer, I control the shell company, and I control the private banking institution that holds the escrow account. I placed my glass down on the mahogany desk. The sadness of losing my son was officially gone, replaced by a cold, calculating precision. They wanted to play a game of ruthless survival. They wanted to throw me to the wolves, but they forgot that I spent 3 decades swimming with the biggest sharks in this city. The hunt was officially on. I was going to let them wake up tomorrow morning. I was going to let them taste the absolute euphoric peak of victory. And then I was going to drag them down to the bottom of the ocean. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds over Chicago, casting a bright, blinding light across the snow-covered city. The Category 3 blizzard had finally passed, leaving the streets buried under 2 feet of solid white ice. But inside my luxury penthouse at the top of the Apex Tower, it was warm, quiet, and perfectly still. I woke up at 7 in the morning. I did not feel the aches and pains of a 72-year-old man who had been thrown out into the freezing cold. I felt invigorated. I felt like a man who was about to watch his enemies walk directly into a perfectly designed trap. I walked into my sprawling kitchen, poured myself a cup of rich black coffee, and carried it into my master's study. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and opened my encrypted laptop. It was 7:45 in the morning, the exact time the massive wire transfer from my shell company, Blue Oak LLC, was scheduled to hit my son's joint bank account. I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured the scene playing out in the house they had stolen from me. I could imagine Darius and his arrogant wife Vanessa waking up with smug smiles on their faces. They had survived the storm. They had kicked the useless old man to the curb, and now they were waiting for their grand prize. I could see Vanessa sitting at the kitchen table in her expensive silk robe, drinking her imported matcha tea, frantically refreshing the banking app on her phone every 10 seconds. She was desperate. She was drowning in debt from her high-end wellness spa, and her private equity investors were threatening to seize everything she owned if she did not make a massive payment by 3 o'clock this afternoon. At exactly 8 o'clock, the digital transaction cleared on my screen. $1,200,000 moved out of my corporate holding account and landed directly into their primary checking account. For exactly 3 minutes, my son and his wife were millionaires. For exactly 3 minutes, they felt like they were the smartest, most untouchable people in the city of Chicago. They felt absolutely invincible. But they did not know about the invisible tripwire I had attached to that money. You see, when you operate multi-million-dollar shell companies and spend 35 years working in city zoning and commercial planning, you do not just use regular retail banking. You have direct lines to the fraud detection departments of major financial institutions. I had not just wired them the money. I had flagged the entire transaction through my legal team as a high-risk real estate anomaly involving potential elder exploitation. But I took it one step further. Before the sun even came up, I had my ruthless attorney Julian Reed file a suspicious activity report with the Internal Revenue Service and the FBI White-Collar Crime Division. The red flag we raised was massive. A sudden 7-figure cash influx tied to a property previously owned by an elderly man who was abruptly and suspiciously removed from the premises the night before. The American banking system did exactly what it was programmed to do when it smells federal fraud. It slammed the steel doors shut. I picked up the sleek silver phone on my desk and dialed Julian. He answered on the first ring. He had a contact inside the bank's branch management network. Julian put me on speakerphone so we could monitor the fallout in real time. "They are trying to move the money right now, Clay," Julian said, his voice laced with a cold professional amusement. "Darius just initiated a wire transfer to a private equity group to pay off his wife's business debt." I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. "Let it bounce, Julian," I said quietly. In their kitchen in Hyde Park, Darius hit the confirm button on his banking app. He expected to see a green success checkmark. He expected to breathe a massive sigh of relief. Instead, his phone screen flashed a violent bright red. Error code 404. Account frozen pending federal review. Action restricted by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I could almost feel the blood draining from my son's face all the way from my penthouse, the smug, arrogant smile melting into pure, unadulterated terror. He tried the transfer again. Denied. He tried to move just $100 to his savings account to see if it was a glitch. Denied. He was completely locked out of his entire financial life. My phone buzzed again. It was a forwarded audio feed from the bank manager's office. Darius was calling the branch, and he was completely losing his mind. "What do you mean my account is frozen?" Darius yelled over the phone. His voice was cracking, high-pitched, and completely stripped of the tough guy act he had put on for me last night on the freezing porch. "I just received a legitimate real estate payment. I sold a house. I need to wire those funds right this second. Release the hold." The branch manager, following strict federal protocols, replied with a cold, robotic tone. "Sir, I cannot override a federal freeze. Your account has been flagged for highly suspicious financial activity and potential title fraud. The IRS and the FBI have placed a hard lock on all your assets until a full comprehensive investigation is conducted." In the background of that phone call, I heard a sound that was pure music to my ears. It was Vanessa. She was screaming. She was not just crying, she was shrieking like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut on its leg. "What do you mean we cannot touch the money?" Darius, Vanessa shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the phone line. "The deadline for my spa investors is at 3 o'clock this afternoon. If we do not wire them that payment today, they are going to seize the business. They are going to take the spa. They are going to take our cars. They are going to take everything. Fix this right now. Fix this right now." Darius begged the bank manager, completely ignoring his wife's hysterical breakdown. "You do not understand. If I do not move this money today, we are completely ruined. You have to let the transfer go through. I will bring the deed to the bank. I will bring the closing documents. I will bring whatever you want. Just unlock the account." "I am sorry, sir," the manager said, not sounding sorry at all. "If you try to access these funds digitally again, or if you attempt to circumvent this freeze in any way, I am legally obligated to contact federal authorities to have you detained. Have a good day." The line went dead. I sat back in my leather chair, looking out over the snow-covered city. The storm outside had settled, but the hurricane inside my son's house had just made devastating landfall. They had the money. It was right there on their screen, teasing them. $1.2 million. But they could not touch a single penny. It was like dying of thirst while staring through soundproof glass at an ocean of fresh water. Vanessa was screaming about her creditors. She was blaming Darius. She was throwing things across the kitchen. The luxurious, untouchable life she thought she had secured by throwing a 72-year-old man into a blizzard was crumbling around her in real time. They were completely paralyzed by fear and financial ruin. And the absolute best part was that they still had absolutely no idea that I was the one pulling the strings. They thought it was just terrible luck. They thought it was an overzealous banking system glitching at the worst possible moment. They thought they just needed to go down to the bank and clear up a simple misunderstanding. I finished my coffee and placed the mug neatly on my desk. I walked over to my expansive closet and pulled out a tailored charcoal suit and a heavy wool overcoat. My work for the morning was not done. Letting them panic in their kitchen was just the appetizer. Now it was time to force them out into the open. It was time for them to walk into that bank, desperate and sweating, and discover the real horrifying reason the federal government was suddenly so interested in the house they stole from me. I checked my gold pocket watch. The bank opened in 30 minutes. I was going to be parked right across the street watching the main entrance. I wanted a front row seat to their destruction. I sat in the back of a blacked-out luxury SUV parked directly across the street from the downtown branch of the First National Bank. The engine idled silently, keeping the cabin perfectly warm against the freezing Chicago morning. Through the heavily tinted windows, I had a front row seat to the greatest show on earth, the destruction of my son. At exactly 9:15, a sleek silver Range Rover careened around the corner, sliding slightly on the slush-covered pavement. It hopped the curb and parked illegally in a loading zone. Darius and Vanessa practically fell out of the vehicle. They did not look like the smug, entitled couple who had tossed me out into a blizzard the night before. Darius was not wearing his expensive cashmere coat. He had thrown on a wrinkled jacket. Vanessa was wearing sweatpants and a messy bun. Panic does not care about your aesthetic. They sprinted across the icy sidewalk, slipping and stumbling, desperate to get through the heavy glass doors of the bank. They thought they were walking in to demand an apology from a teller and unlock their money. They had no idea they were walking straight into a federal interrogation. I picked up my phone. My lawyer, Julian Reed, was already on the line. Julian is an apex predator in a $3,000 suit, and he has high-level contacts in every major financial institution in the city. He had arranged for the branch manager, a strict, no-nonsense man named Mr. Sterling, to handle my son personally. Julian had a live audio feed of the meeting patched directly through to my phone, perfectly legal under the bank internal fraud investigation protocols. I pressed the phone to my ear, leaned back against the plush leather seat, and listened to the rats enter the maze. I heard the heavy door of the manager office click shut. Then Vanessa's voice pierced the audio feed. It was shrill, desperate, and dripping with her usual toxic entitlement. She demanded that Mr. Sterling release the hold on their account immediately. She barked that they had a massive commercial payment due at 3 o'clock and that the money was legally theirs. She claimed they just sold a house, had the closing documents, and that the bank system made a mistake that was about to cost her entire business. Darius chimed in, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. He told the manager they did not want to make a scene, but they would call their lawyers if the issue was not resolved in the next 5 minutes. He ordered him to just authorize the wire transfer. The silence from Mr. Sterling was absolute perfection. I could picture him sitting behind his mahogany desk looking at them with the detached clinical expression of a surgeon about to amputate an infected limb. When he finally spoke, his voice was chillingly calm. He told them there was no system mistake. He highly recommended they call their lawyers because they were going to need them very soon. I heard Darius swallow hard, asking what that was supposed to mean, as his fake bravado instantly evaporated. Mr. Sterling stated flatly that their account was not frozen because of a technical glitch. It was frozen by the Federal Fraud Division. He explained that the $1.2 million wire transfer they received this morning had been flagged for catastrophic irregularities regarding the chain of title on the property they just sold. Vanessa scoffed loudly, calling it ridiculous. She argued that Darius' father transferred the deed to him 2 years ago and that they had the quitclaim deed notarized and filed with the county, making it completely legal. I smiled in the darkness of my SUV. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. This was the trap I had set 2 years ago when Darius first brought me those papers. Mr. Sterling continued, his tone dropping to a lethal whisper. He told them the bank had reviewed the quitclaim deed. He noted that the deed transferred ownership of the property located in Hyde Park from Clarence Montgomery and Beatrice Montgomery over to Darius Montgomery. He pointed out that the document was dated and signed exactly 24 months ago, featuring 3 signatures. Darius' signature, my signature, and my late wife Beatrice's signature. I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath from Darius. It was the sound of a man realizing he had just stepped off a cliff in the dark. Mr. Sterling dropped the bomb with absolute precision. He explained that a preliminary background check required for transfers of this magnitude revealed a very alarming discrepancy. He looked Darius dead in the eye and stated that his mother, Beatrice Montgomery, passed away 48 months ago, 2 full years before the document was supposedly signed in front of a notary. The silence in that bank office must have been suffocating. I could picture the blood draining completely out of Darius' face. He thought he was so smart. When he pressured me to sign that deed 2 years ago, he knew the house was originally in both my name and my late wife's name. To bypass the lengthy probate process and avoid paying the estate taxes he was so terrified of, he took a shortcut. He simply forged his dead mother's signature on the legal transfer documents. He paid off a shady notary to stamp it, thinking nobody would ever look closely at a simple family transfer. He thought the system was too slow and too stupid to catch him. But when you sell a house for over $1 million in cash to a corporate entity, the bank scrutinizes every single millimeter of the paperwork, especially when that corporate entity is owned by the man you just kicked out into the snow. Mr. Sterling explained coldly that forging the signature of a deceased individual on a real estate transfer document is not a minor clerical error. It is a Class 2 felony. It constitutes federal wire fraud, title fraud, and grand larceny. He told them the United States government takes a very dim view of people who use ghosts to steal property. Because the foundation of the sale was based on a fraudulent deed, the transaction was entirely void. The $1.2 million did not belong to them. It was currently being seized by federal authorities as evidence of a major financial crime. Vanessa let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. The microphone picked up the sound of her chair scraping violently against the floor as she stood up. She did not turn her anger toward the bank manager. She turned it entirely on the man sitting next to her, the man she had sworn to love through thick and thin. She screamed at Darius, asking what the manager was talking about. Her voice echoed off the walls of the small office. She yelled that he forged his dead mother's signature and that he told her the house transfer was completely legal. She shrieked that he promised his father signed everything over willingly. Darius was stammering, his voice weak and pathetic. He begged Vanessa to listen to him, claiming he had to do it because the taxes would have eaten up the equity. He cried that he did it for them and to get the capital for her business. She did not care about his excuses. She did not care about his sacrifices. She only cared about her own survival. She roared at him, completely unhinged, calling him a liar. She screamed that he committed a federal felony and tied her name to a fraudulent property sale. She cried that her business was going to be seized this afternoon, and she was going to go to prison because she was married to a stupid, incompetent criminal. Darius yelled back, the pressure finally snapping his fragile nerves. He told Vanessa to shut up. He screamed that she was the one who needed the money and burned through all their cash trying to look like a millionaire. He roared that she was the one who threw his father out into a blizzard so they could close this deal today. They were tearing each other apart. The perfect, arrogant, upper-class couple was completely disintegrating right there in the bank manager office. They were no longer husband and wife. They were two cornered animals biting and clawing at each other to escape a trap there was no way out of. I tapped the screen of my phone and ended the call with Julian. I rolled down the tinted window of the SUV just a few inches. The freezing wind bit at my face, but I did not feel the cold. I felt absolutely spectacular. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the bank burst open. Darius and Vanessa stumbled out onto the icy sidewalk. They were not holding hands. They were screaming at each other, their faces red with rage and panic. People on the street were stopping to stare at them. Vanessa shoved Darius hard in the chest, pointing a trembling finger in his face before storming off toward their illegally parked Range Rover, leaving him standing alone in the slush. I watched my son run his hands over his face, completely broken, entirely destroyed by his own greed. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I rolled the window back up and signaled my driver to pull away. They had lost the money. They had lost their marriage. And the absolute best part was they had not even seen the worst of it yet. It did not take long for Vanessa to play her final desperate card. When you back a narcissist into a corner and strip away their money, they do not self-reflect. They do not apologize. They immediately construct a narrative where they are the absolute victim. By Wednesday morning, she realized the money was truly gone, and her business was on the brink of total collapse. So she resorted to the oldest, most predictable weapon in her arsenal. I was sitting in my penthouse drinking my morning coffee when my lawyer, Julian Reed, called me. He did not bother saying hello. He just told me to open my computer and check the links he had just sent to my email. I opened the laptop and clicked the first link. It took me to a social media platform. TikTok. I do not use social media, but I understand how the game is played. The video on my screen already had over 2 million views, and sitting right in the center of the frame looking directly into the camera with red puffy eyes was my daughter-in-law Vanessa. She had set the scene with absolute manipulative perfection. She was sitting on the floor of her expensive boutique wellness spa wearing a plain, oversized gray sweater. She had wiped off all her expensive makeup. Her hair was messy. She looked small, fragile, and utterly terrified. She was broadcasting a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She spoke to her 50,000 followers with a trembling voice. She told them a story about a young female entrepreneur under attack. She wiped away a single perfectly timed tear and looked into the lens. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," Vanessa said, her voice cracking. "But I am terrified for my safety and my business. My husband, Father Clarence, has been living with us. We have tried to give him everything. We tried to get him medical help because his mind is slipping. He is suffering from severe dementia. But recently he became violent and completely paranoid." She paused, taking a deep, shaky breath for dramatic effect. "He is currently being manipulated by greedy, predatory lawyers," she continued. "They are using his confused mental state to extort me. They froze our family bank accounts. They are trying to steal the wellness spa that I built with my own 2 hands. He cornered us at the bank yesterday and threatened us. I am just a young woman trying to run a small business, and I am so scared of what this angry, unpredictable man might do next to me or my family." I sat in the silence of my penthouse and watched this 33-year-old white woman weaponize her tears against a 72-year-old black man. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the dark history of this country. She knew the stereotypes. She knew that society is hardwired to fiercely protect a crying, fragile white woman and to instantly fear an angry, unpredictable black man. She was painting me as a violent, deranged threat to cover up the fact that her husband had forged a federal document. She did not stop there. The second link Julian sent me was from LinkedIn, the professional networking site. Vanessa had posted a similar video there, but tailored for a corporate audience. She wrote a long caption about being a female founder facing vicious legal extortion from a toxic family member. She claimed her business was under siege by malicious lawsuits and begged the Atlanta business community to stand with her against elder financial abuse. She was trying to turn my stolen money into a feminist crusade. The consequences were immediate and absolutely vicious. The comment section under her videos was an absolute war zone. Thousands of strangers were calling for my arrest. People were telling her to get a restraining order. They were calling me a monster, a parasite, and an abuser. The digital mob had been unleashed. They did not know I was a millionaire. They did not know I was a former city zoning director. They only knew my name, and they thought I was a crazy, violent old man ruining a young woman's dream. People began leaving hundreds of fake one-star reviews on local business pages, mistakenly associating me with random companies. Strangers were sending death threats to the old house in Hyde Park, completely unaware that I had already evicted myself from the premises. Half an hour later, Julian walked through the front doors of my penthouse. He was furious. He threw his leather briefcase onto my dining table and started pulling out stacks of printed screenshots. "Clay, this is textbook defamation," Julian said, his voice vibrating with professional outrage. "This is libel per se. She is assassinating your character in front of millions of people. She used your full name. She is accusing you of federal extortion and physical threats. We can file an injunction by noon. We can hit her with a massive cease and desist order. We can take her to civil court and strip away every single asset she claims to own. We can have her social media accounts permanently shut down before the sun goes down today." I walked over to the kitchen island and poured myself another cup of coffee. I moved slowly, smoothly, completely unbothered by the stacks of paper Julian was waving around. I took a sip of the hot, dark liquid and looked at my lawyer. "No," I said quietly. "We are not going to sue her for defamation. Do not file a single piece of paper." Julian stopped pacing. He stared at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Clay, she is destroying your reputation. She is mobilizing a digital army against you. You cannot just sit back and let her broadcast these lies. You have to strike back immediately." "I am striking back, Julian," I replied. "But you do not swat a fly with a sledgehammer. And you absolutely do not fight a public lie with a legal press release." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the sprawling city. "Think about it, Julian," I explained. "If we sue her for defamation right now, we give her exactly what she wants. She wants a public fight. If we send a cease and desist, she will post a video crying about how the big bad rich lawyers are trying to silence her truth. She will set up a crowdfunding campaign and raise $500,000 from sympathetic strangers. She will become a martyr. Defamation lawsuits take years to litigate. I do not want to fight her in the court of public opinion for the next 3 years. I want to cut her oxygen supply right now." Julian slowly lowered the stack of papers to the table. His eyes narrowed as he began to see the invisible lines I was drawing. "Then, what exactly are we going to do, Clay?" he asked. I turned away from the window and looked Julian dead in the eye. "I do not care about her internet followers," I told him. "I care about her cash flow. She missed her massive payment to her private equity investors yesterday because I froze the bank account. She is completely broke, but she is still sitting in that expensive boutique spa making videos. She is still operating her business. I want your forensic accounting team to stop looking at TikTok and start looking at her business licenses." I walked over to the table and tapped my finger against the polished wood. "I want to know exactly how a woman who is drowning in personal debt managed to secure a premium commercial lease in one of the most expensive districts in this city. I want her tax records. I want her operating agreements. But most importantly, Julian, I want to know exactly who holds the commercial lease for that building. Find out who her landlord is." Julian let out a slow breath. A dangerous, predatory smile began to spread across his face. "You think she lied on her commercial lease agreement?" he asked. "I know she did," I replied. "You do not get a prime commercial property with a failing credit score unless you commit serious financial fraud on the application. She probably forged income statements. She probably claimed assets she does not own. I want your team to dig into every single piece of paper she ever submitted to open that spa." I straightened the collar of my shirt. Let the internet strangers scream Julian. Let Vanessa feel victorious. Let her climb as high as she possibly can on her mountain of fake victimhood, because the higher she climbs, the harder the impact will be when I completely shatter the concrete foundation she is standing on. Find the lease, Julian. Find the bloodline of her business. Julian packed the screenshots back into his briefcase and snapped it shut. "Consider it done, Clay. My team will tear her corporate history apart piece by piece. We will have the name of her commercial landlord by tonight." Julian walked out of the penthouse, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the city below. I sat back down in my leather chair and took another sip of coffee. Vanessa thought she could use her white tears to paint a target on my back. She thought she was playing a game of public relations. She had no idea she was playing a game of total financial annihilation. I was not going to argue with her on the internet. I was going to quietly, legally, and ruthlessly repossess her entire world. The sun was beginning to set over the freezing city of Chicago, casting a deep orange glow across the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I was standing by the glass looking down at the icy streets below when the private intercom on my mahogany desk buzzed softly. It was the head concierge down in the main lobby. His voice sounded tight and uncomfortable. "Mr. Montgomery," the concierge said carefully. "I am so sorry to disturb your evening, sir. There is a couple down here in the lobby making quite a scene. An older white gentleman and a woman. They bypassed the main security desk and are demanding to be led up to your residence. They claim they are your family by marriage. I threatened to call building security, but the man said he hired a private investigator to find this address, and he will not leave until he speaks with you." I knew exactly who was standing in my lobby. Richard and Diane, Vanessa's parents. The people who raised the entitled, spoiled woman who had thrown me out into a blizzard. My first instinct was to tell the concierge to have them physically removed from the premises and thrown back out into the snow. But 35 years of navigating the vicious political waters of Chicago had taught me a very valuable lesson. You never stop your enemy when they are in the middle of making a catastrophic mistake. You open the door, and you let them walk right into the trap. "Send them up," I said calmly. I stood in the center of my expansive living room and waited. A few minutes later, the heavy steel doors of the private elevator chimed and slid open. Richard and Diane stepped out into my home. They came ready for a fight, but the moment they stepped off the elevator, their entire aggressive demeanor hit a brick wall. They looked around the 6,000-square-foot penthouse in absolute stunning disbelief. They took in the imported Italian marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the modern art hanging on the walls, and the breathtaking panoramic view of the financial district. Diane clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest. Her mouth literally fell open. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. He was wearing a tight, tailored suit that screamed new money and desperation. He swallowed hard, his face turning a slight shade of red as his brain struggled to process the reality in front of him. They were conditioned to look down on me. They had convinced themselves that I was just a poor, tired old black man who had spent his life scraping the bottom of the barrel. Their narrow, prejudiced minds simply could not comprehend how a retired city worker could be standing in the crown jewel of the apex tower. But arrogance is a very stubborn disease. It did not take long for Richard to override his confusion with a narrative that fit his own twisted worldview. He quickly rearranged his face into a familiar, condescending sneer. "Well," Richard said, stepping fully into the living room without asking for permission, "I suppose this explains where the stolen money went. It is truly amazing what a person can rent when they drain their own son's bank accounts and hide from their responsibilities. I did not offer them a seat. I did not offer them a drink. I just stood there with my hands resting casually in the pockets of my dark trousers. Inside my right pocket, my thumb rested gently against the tactile button of a small digital voice recorder. With a silent press, I turned it on. The red recording light illuminated in the dark fabric of my pocket. I was capturing every single word. "How did you find this place, Richard?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. Richard smirked, unbuttoning his suit jacket as if he owned the room. "You really think you can hide from us, Clay? When Vanessa called us in tears because you locked the family bank accounts and terrorized her at the bank, I hired a private investigator. It took him less than 24 hours to track you down. You might think you are clever hiding out in a luxury rental trying to play the big shot, but you are completely out of your depth." Diane stepped forward, crossing her arms tightly. The heavy smell of her expensive perfume filled my living room. "We know you are not well, Clay," she said, using that same fake, sugary tone her daughter used. "Vanessa told us everything about your cognitive decline. We know you have been acting out, becoming violent, taking money that does not belong to you. We are here to intervene before you hurt yourself or our daughter any further." I looked at them with a cold, detached fascination. Even standing in the middle of a multi-million-dollar penthouse, they were so blinded by their own superiority complex that they literally could not fathom that I owned it. They had convinced themselves I was a crazy old man squatting in luxury on their daughter's dime. "Why are you really here, Richard?" I asked. "Cut the act. You did not hire an expensive private investigator just to check on my health. Richard dropped the fake polite smile. His face grew hard, cold, and entirely ruthless. He took a heavy step closer to me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. But I had spent decades dealing with corrupt union bosses and cutthroat real estate developers. A soft-handed country club executive was not going to make me flinch. "I am here to fix the mess you created," Richard said, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. "My daughter's reputation is taking a hit because of your little stunts. Darius is a weak man who cannot handle his own household, but Vanessa is my blood. I will not let a stubborn, washed-up old man drag her down and ruin her business." He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. He tossed it onto my glass coffee table with a loud smack. He pulled a gold pen from his pocket and quickly scribbled on the paper. He tore the check out and slid it across the glass toward me. "Here is how this is going to work," Richard said, leaning aggressively over the table. "I just wrote you a check for $50,000. You are going to take that money right now. You are going to pick up your phone and call the bank manager. You are going to drop this ridiculous federal fraud complaint, and you are going to tell them to release the $1.2 million to my daughter immediately." I looked down at the check on the table. $50,000. Then I looked back up at Richard. "And if I refuse?" Diane let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. "Oh, Clay, please do not make this harder than it has to be. If you force our hand, we will have absolutely no choice but to protect Vanessa by any means necessary." Richard nodded, a malicious glint shining in his eye. "If you do not take that money and drop the complaint right now, my lawyers will make your life a living hell in Chicago. We will sue you for the emotional abuse and psychological distress you have inflicted on my daughter. We will use the viral social media videos she posted. We will use the medical records she gathered, and we will drag your name through the absolute mud. We will tie you up in court for years until you are completely bankrupt." He pointed a finger directly at my chest. "People like you need to learn to know their place," Richard spat, the ugly, elitist undertone of his words completely unhidden now. "You were lucky my daughter even let you live in that house for as long as she did. You are nothing but a burden. Take the money, fix the bank account, and we let you disappear in peace. Fight us, and I will personally make sure a judge declares you mentally incompetent and locks you in a state-run psychiatric facility for the rest of your miserable life." The silence in the penthouse was profound. The sheer audacity, the staggering entitlement of these people was breathtaking. They had marched into my home, insulted my intelligence, threatened my freedom, and attempted to bribe me to cover up a federal felony committed by my own son. And they had just confessed to all of it on a digital recording. Bribery, extortion, blackmail, conspiracy to commit medical fraud. My thumb brushed against the stop button on the recorder inside my pocket, securing the file. I had everything I needed. They had just delivered the final nail for their own coffins on a silver platter. I looked at Richard. I looked at Diane. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice or throw them out by their collars. I simply smiled. It was a cold, empty smile that did not reach my eyes. I walked over to the glass coffee table. I looked at the $50,000 check. I placed my index finger on the crisp paper and slowly, deliberately pushed it back across the glass until it rested right in front of Richard. Richard's face turned purple with rage. "Are you deaf, old man?" he shouted, dropping the polite facade entirely. "Did you not hear a single word I just said? I will destroy you. I will take everything you have." I looked Richard dead in the eye. My voice was dangerously quiet, cutting through his shouting like a razor blade. "Do what you think is right, Richard," I said casually. "The door is behind you." Diane gasped, grabbing her husband's arm in panic. "Richard, let us go. He has completely lost his mind. There is no talking to him. He is totally delusional." I stepped aside and gestured toward the private elevator. "You know the way out," I told them. "And I suggest you tell your daughter to enjoy her fake wellness spa while she still can, because the weather in Chicago is about to change very drastically." Richard glared at me, his chest heaving with anger. He snatched the check off the table and shoved it into his pocket. "You are going to regret this, Clay. You are going to die with absolutely nothing." He turned around and stormed into the elevator with Diane close behind him. The steel doors slid shut, hiding their furious faces from my sight. I stood alone in the quiet penthouse. I pulled the digital recorder out of my pocket and looked at the glowing red screen. I had let them walk away feeling powerful. I let them believe they were the predators and I was just cornered prey. but they had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me a loaded gun. I walked over to my desk and picked up my phone to call my lawyer. The trap was perfectly set. I was still standing in the quiet of my penthouse holding the digital recorder that contained the desperate threats of Vanessa's parents when my private cell phone began to ring. It was an unknown number. I normally do not answer unsolicited calls, especially when I'm in the middle of preparing a legal slaughter. But something in my gut, that instinct forged over 35 years of navigating Chicago cutthroat zoning department, told me to pick it up. I answered the phone without saying my name. A woman voice came through the speaker. She sounded nervous, her breath hitching slightly, but there was an underlying current of absolute determination in her tone. She asked if she was speaking to Clarence Montgomery. She said I did not know her, but she knew exactly who I was, and more importantly, she knew exactly what my daughter-in-law was hiding. I asked her for her name. She told me her name was Kendra. She was a 31-year-old black woman who worked as the general manager of Vanessa high-end boutique wellness spa. She told me she had seen the viral video Vanessa posted online crying about a violent, deranged father-in-law. Kendra said she knew it was a complete fabrication because she knew the real reason Vanessa was panicking in her office behind closed doors. She said she had something I needed to see, something that would put Vanessa and my son away for a very long time. I did not hesitate. I told her to meet me in 30 minutes at a 24-hour diner on the south side of the city, a place far away from the glittering lights of the financial district and the arrogant eyes of the Buckhead elites. I put on my old puffer jacket, leaving the luxury suit behind. I drove my rusted Chevy truck through the freezing snow-lined streets of Chicago. When I walked into the diner, it was nearly empty. The smell of cheap coffee and fried grease hung in the air. I spotted her immediately sitting in a back booth. Kendra looked exhausted. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her posture carried the heavy weight of a woman who was constantly overworked and fundamentally disrespected. I slid into the booth across from her. I ordered 2 black coffees from the waitress and waited for Kendra to speak. She looked at me, studying my face, perhaps expecting the crazed, senile old man her boss had described to the world. Instead, she saw a man who was perfectly calm, perfectly lucid, and entirely ready to listen. Kendra wrapped her hands around her warm coffee mug and began to talk. She told me what it was really like working for a woman like Vanessa. She described the daily microaggressions, the condescending tone, the way Vanessa treated her like the hired help, despite the fact that Kendra held a master's degree in business administration. Vanessa was the face of the spa. She took the photos, drank the champagne, and accepted the praise. But Kendra was the one who actually ran the operations, managed the staff, and balanced the books. Kendra said Vanessa thought she was just a glorified receptionist. She thought Kendra was too ignorant to understand the financial spreadsheets she was ordered to file. But Kendra saw everything. And when she saw the video of Vanessa weaponizing her white tears against an elderly black man, knowing the devastating consequences that kind of lie carries in this country, Kendra decided she had finally seen enough. She reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. She slid it across the sticky diner table toward me. I kept backups of everything, Mr. Montgomery, Kendra said, her voice dropping to a serious, calculated whisper. When the bank accounts were frozen yesterday, Vanessa went into a state of absolute hysteria. She started frantically shredding documents in her office. She ordered me to delete digital files from the main server, but I had already copied the internal financial ledgers to a secure drive weeks ago, because I knew the ship was sinking and I refused to let her drag me down with it. I opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of printed spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and internal payroll documents. I put on my reading glasses and began to scan the numbers. What I saw on those pages completely eclipsed the theft of my house. It eclipsed the $80,000 they stole from my emergency fund. What I was looking at was a massive, systemic, and utterly devastating federal crime. Vanessa was not just drowning in $1.5 million of commercial debt. She was actively stealing from her own employees to keep her fake luxury lifestyle afloat. I looked at the payroll ledgers. Vanessa had been deducting federal income taxes, state taxes, and Social Security contributions from the paychecks of her entire staff, including the massage therapists, the cleaners, and the trainers. But she was not submitting that money to the Internal Revenue Service. She was illegally pocketing their tax withholdings and funneling the cash straight into her own personal accounts. She was using the hard-earned money of working-class people to pay for her designer clothes, her expensive dinners, and her leased Range Rover. But it did not stop there. I flipped to the next page. There were records of hundreds of fake client memberships. Phantom customers paying thousands of dollars in cash every month. It was textbook money laundering. They were trying to wash dirty money through the spa to inflate their revenue and trick their investors into giving them more time. My eyes moved to the bottom of the financial authorization forms. I needed to see who was officially signing off on these fraudulent transactions. There, printed clearly in black ink, was the signature of the registered chief financial officer of the wellness spa, Darius Montgomery, my son. I stared at his signature, and the air in my lungs turned to ash. Up until this very moment, a small, foolish, microscopic part of my soul wanted to believe that Darius was just a weak man. I wanted to believe he was just a coward who had been completely manipulated and bullied by a toxic, greedy wife. I wanted to believe he was just making terrible choices out of desperation to keep his marriage intact. But this document proved otherwise. You do not accidentally set up phantom LLCs to launder money. You do not accidentally steal the tax withholdings of your minimum wage employees. Darius was not a victim of his wife's ambition. He was a willing, active, and malicious co-conspirator. He was the architect of the fraud. He was a thief. And worse than that, he was stealing from the working class. He was stealing from people who lived paycheck to paycheck, people who trusted their employer. People who would end up owing thousands of dollars to the IRS and potentially face financial ruin because my son decided he needed a luxury lifestyle he did not earn. I remembered the 35 years I spent working for the city. I remembered the men and women I worked alongside, people who broke their backs for a modest pension. I remembered my late wife Beatrice, who worked 2 jobs just so we could afford our first mortgage. We taught Darius the value of an honest dollar. We taught him to respect the labor of others. And he had taken those lessons, spat on them, and became the exact kind of parasite I had spent my entire life fighting against. The last remaining thread of paternal love tying me to my son snapped. It did not break with a loud noise. It just dissolved into a cold, clinical void. The man who forged these documents was not my blood. He was a criminal who needed to be completely eradicated from society. I closed the folder and looked up at Kendra. Her eyes were wide, watching the silent transformation happen across my face. "You did the right thing, bringing this to me, Kendra," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "This goes far beyond elder abuse. This is federal tax evasion and wire fraud. If they go down, they will try to drag you with them. But you have my word, you are fully protected." I reached into my pocket, pulled out my checkbook, and wrote her a personal check for $25,000. I slid it across the table. "Take this," I told her. "Keep your mouth completely shut. Go to work tomorrow like nothing happened. And when the federal agents raid that spa, you hand them your hard drive and you tell them everything. When the dust settles and that building is empty, I am going to buy the commercial lease. And you are going to have your own business." Kendra looked at the check. Tears welled up in her eyes. She nodded slowly, slipping the paper into her bag. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. I will not say a word." She got up and left the diner, disappearing into the snowy night. I sat alone in the booth. I pulled out my phone and called Julian Reed. It was past midnight, but he answered immediately. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the static of the line like a scalpel. "I need you to contact the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI first thing in the morning. I have the smoking gun." I told him everything I had just discovered. The tax fraud, the money laundering, the fake client memberships. I heard Julian take a sharp intake of breath over the phone. Clay Julian said, his professional tone shifting into something far more serious. "If we hand this over to the federal authorities, there is no turning back. They will not just lose the house or the business. Darius will face 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Are you absolutely certain you want to pull this trigger on your own son?" I looked out the diner window at my rusted Chevy truck covered in a fresh layer of snow. I thought about the house I built. I thought about Beatrice. I thought about the hard-working employees whose futures Darius was destroying without a second thought. "Darius Montgomery is not my son," I replied. "He is a thief standing in my way. Hand the documents over to the feds, Julian. Burn them to the ground." I hung up the phone. The father was officially dead. The executioner had gathered all his ammunition, and the slaughter was ready to begin. Thursday morning began with the kind of quiet that usually follows a violent storm. I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking a cup of dark roast coffee and watching the city of Chicago slowly thaw out under a pale winter sun. I had set the wheels of federal justice in motion the night before. The tax evasion documents and the money laundering evidence were safely in the hands of my lawyer, ready to be delivered to the authorities. I thought I had them completely pinned down. I thought they were out of moves. But I forgot a fundamental rule about desperate people. When you back a rat into a corner and cut off its food supply, it does not just surrender. It goes straight for the throat. At exactly 9 in the morning, the private intercom on my mahogany desk chimed. It was the lobby concierge. His voice was incredibly tense and formal. He told me there were 2 uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department standing at his desk. They had a court order and they demanded to be sent up to my residence immediately. I did not panic. I put my coffee mug down, smoothed the front of my shirt, and pressed the button to unlock the private elevator. A few moments later, the heavy steel doors opened in my foyer. 2 officers stepped out, looking slightly out of place in the middle of a luxury penthouse. They were not aggressive, but their faces were entirely stoic and professional. The taller officer held a thick manila envelope in his gloved hand. He asked if I was Clarence Montgomery. I told him I was. He handed me the envelope and stated that I was being formally served by the Cook County Probate Court. He told me I was required to appear in front of a judge the very next morning for an emergency hearing. They did not explain anything else. They just turned around and took the elevator back down. I stood alone in the quiet foyer holding the heavy envelope. It felt like holding a live explosive. I walked over to my desk, sat down in my leather chair, and tore the seal open. I pulled out a stack of dense legal documents heavily stamped with the seal of the county court. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the bold black letters at the very top of the page. Petition for emergency guardianship and declaration of incompetence. The petitioner was listed as Darius Montgomery, my own son. The respondent was me. I read through the pages and the air in my lungs suddenly turned to ice. This was not a lawsuit for money. This was a calculated legal assassination. Darius and Vanessa were not just trying to get their hands on the $1.2 million. They were trying to erase my entire existence. In the sworn affidavit attached to the petition, my son painted a picture of a broken, delusional, and deeply paranoid old man. He claimed that I was suffering from severe age-related dementia. He wrote that my mental state had deteriorated so rapidly over the past year that I was a danger to myself and to the public. He cited my sudden disappearance into the blizzard as proof of my erratic behavior, conveniently leaving out the part where his wife threw my clothes out the front door and told me to leave. He claimed that I was experiencing paranoid delusions about my finances, which led me to irrationally freeze the family bank accounts. He even referenced the viral videos Vanessa posted online using the fake outrage of her internet followers as evidence that I was terrorizing a young female business owner. But the absolute darkest part of the document was their ultimate goal. Darius was petitioning the court to strip me of all my civil rights. He was asking a judge to grant him full emergency control over my medical decisions and my entire financial estate. He specifically requested the legal authority to take over the management of Blue Oak LLC. He had figured it out. He realized that the anonymous cash buyer of his house was a shell company. He realized that the only way to unfreeze the bank accounts and save Vanessa failing spa was to completely take over the company that initiated the transaction. And the only way to do that was to have the owner of the company declared legally insane. The sheer brilliant evil of their plan washed over me. If a judge looked at this paperwork and believed their lies, I would become a ghost, a ward of the state. I would lose the right to sign a check to drive my car, or to even decide what I wanted to eat for breakfast. Darius and Vanessa would be granted the legal power to walk into this penthouse with armed police officers, drag me out of my own home, and lock me inside a state-run psychiatric facility. They would not put me in a nice place. They would put me in a cold, sterile building on the edge of the city, a place where difficult old men are pumped full of heavy chemical sedatives just to keep them quiet in a wheelchair. While I sat in a locked ward staring at a blank wall, drooling from the medication, my son and his wife would liquidate my entire empire. They would bleed my life work dry to pay for their luxury cars, their expensive vacations, and their predatory loans. They were going to bury me alive just to maintain their fake high society aesthetic. For one brief, terrible minute, I felt a wave of profound, suffocating dread. The American legal system is a terrifying machine. I am a 72-year-old black man. In a courtroom against a crying, well-dressed white woman and a son playing the role of a devastated caretaker, the odds are historically stacked against me. Judges are busy. They like neat, tragic narratives. They process people like me every single day without batting an eye. But then the fear evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, unyielding fury. I closed my eyes and pictured the woman who threw my clothes into the snow. I pictured the boy I raised standing quietly while it happened. I did not build a multi-million-dollar real estate empire by surrendering to bullies. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer, Julian Reed. He answered on the first ring. I told him they just dropped the nuclear bomb. I told him they served me with a petition for emergency guardianship and they were trying to lock me in a facility to take control of the LLC. I heard Julian let out a sharp, violent curse over the phone line. He told me this was a legal ambush. He said they scheduled the emergency hearing for tomorrow morning intentionally so we would not have time to mount a medical defense. They wanted to blindside me in front of a judge before I could gather proof of my sanity. Julian said if we walked into that courtroom unprepared, I would not walk out a free man. They would have an ambulance waiting at the courthouse to take me away. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the massive window at the city I helped build. I told Julian we were not going to walk in unprepared. I told him I was leaving the penthouse right now to gather the ammunition we needed. I told him that when I saw my son in that courtroom tomorrow, I was not just going to defend my mind. I was going to absolutely obliterate his entire world. I hung up the phone. The game of teaching them a lesson was officially over. This was a fight for my actual life, and I was going to make sure they regretted the day they ever decided to challenge mine. I did not waste a single second. When your own flesh and blood tries to steal your mind on paper, you do not just sit around and wait for the gavel to fall. You build a fortress of undeniable medical facts. Julian Reed is an incredibly expensive lawyer for a very good reason. While I was putting on my heavy wool overcoat, he was already on the phone moving mountains. I told him I needed emergency appointments with the most respected independent board-certified neurologists and psychiatrists in the city of Chicago. Not just one doctor. I wanted 3. I wanted department heads at major university hospitals. Men and women whose expert testimonies had sent serial killers to prison and dismantled massive corporate frauds. I wanted an absolute impenetrable wall of medical evidence. Julian used every favor and every connection he had to clear their schedules. The next 14 hours were the most grueling, invasive cognitive marathon of my entire life. My driver took me from the medical campus at Northwestern down to the University Hospital in Hyde Park. I walked into those bright, sterile white offices and let them look into every single corner of my 72-year-old brain. I demanded they test absolutely everything. They put me inside the loud, humming magnetic resonance imaging machines to scan the physical structure of my brain. They drew vials of my blood to check for any chemical imbalances or signs of degenerative disease. I sat across from top-tier psychiatrists and answered thousands of questions. I solved complex mathematical equations in my head without a pen. I recited long sequences of random numbers backwards. I took spatial reasoning tests and memory retention exams. I analyzed abstract patterns and recalled incredibly specific details from my 35-year career in city zoning. I did not just pass their tests, I dominated them. I wanted zero margin for error. If my son and his entitled wife were going to walk into a courtroom and claim I was a confused, helpless old man, I was going to provide federal-level proof that my mind was a steel trap. I looked at the young doctors administering the tests. They saw a black man in his 70s and probably expected to find a slipping mind. But as I effortlessly completed their puzzles, I saw the respect grow in their eyes. The doctors were actually impressed. They told me my cognitive function was not just normal for my age, it was within the top 1% of the population. They noted my stress responses were incredibly well managed, and my logical reasoning was flawless. I thought about Vanessa posting her crying videos on the internet, claiming I was wandering around paranoid and violent. I thought about Darius signing that sworn affidavit claiming I could not even manage my own daily schedule. They were banking on the inherent bias of the system. They were banking on the fact that society automatically assumes an old man is naturally losing his grip on reality. But they did not know the fire that was burning inside my chest. Every test I took, every puzzle I solved, every scan I endured was another brick in the wall that was going to crush them. By Thursday evening, I walked out of the third and final hospital with 3 heavily sealed notarized envelopes. Inside those thick manila folders were comprehensive psychiatric and neurological evaluations from 3 separate highly decorated medical professionals. All of them stated unequivocally and under penalty of perjury that Clarence Montgomery possessed superior cognitive function, zero signs of dementia, and the complete mental capacity to manage his personal and financial affairs. Their fake medical certificate was now entirely worthless. It was nothing but a piece of trash compared to the mountain of hard medical evidence I held in my hands. I climbed into the back of my private luxury vehicle and told the driver to head straight to Julian Law Firm in the financial district. The sun had already gone down and the city lights were reflecting off the icy streets of Chicago. I was physically exhausted, but my mind was completely electric. I walked past the receptionist and pushed open the heavy oak doors to Julian's private corner office. Julian was sitting at his massive conference table, completely surrounded by stacks of legal documents. He looked up when I walked in and he had a sharp, predatory smile on his face. He pointed to a thin folder resting in the center of the table. He told me to have a seat, tapping the folder with his expensive pen. He said his private investigators had just finished digging into the medical certificate Darius attached to his court petition. He said they found the doctor who signed the affidavit claiming I was suffering from advanced dementia. His name was Dr. Gregory Mercer, and he operated out of a cheap strip mall clinic on the edge of the city. I sat down and placed my 3 sealed medical envelopes on the table. I told Julian to tell me everything. Julian opened the folder and laid out the facts. Dr. Mercer was not a respected physician. He was a complete fraud. Julian explained that Mercer was currently under active investigation by the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration and the State Medical Board. He had a long documented history of writing fake prescriptions and accepting cash bribes to falsify medical records for insurance scams and workers' compensation claims. Darius and Vanessa did not just find a doctor who made a simple misdiagnosis. They found a corrupt, desperate man, and they paid him under the table to fabricate a medical condition out of thin air just to steal my company and unfreeze their bank accounts. I stared at the criminal background report of the corrupt doctor. The sheer magnitude of their desperation was almost laughable. My son, the boy who grew up in a warm, loving home built by his mother, Beatrice, had sunk so incredibly low that he was buying fake medical documents from a strip mall criminal just to save his wife pathetic business. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood table. His voice was full of aggressive energy. He told me we could file an emergency motion right now. We could submit this background check to the judge tonight. We could have their entire petition thrown out before the sun even comes up tomorrow. He said we could have Darius and that fake doctor arrested for conspiracy and perjury immediately. I looked down at my rough, calloused hands. The hands that had poured concrete and signed zoning permits for 35 years. I let out a low, quiet hum. I told Julian no. My voice was dangerously calm. Julian stopped and looked at me completely confused. He asked me what I meant. He said we had the smoking gun and asked why we would wait a single second longer to end this nightmare. I picked up my 3 sealed envelopes and tucked them neatly into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I looked Julian dead in the eye and explained my strategy. I told him that if we stopped them tonight, we gave them a chance to make an excuse. We gave them a chance to claim they were tricked by a bad doctor or that they genuinely believed I was sick. I did not want them to have a single way out. I wanted them to walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning feeling absolutely victorious. I told Julian I wanted Darius to stand in front of that judge, raise his right hand, swear an oath on the Bible, and lie through his teeth. I wanted Vanessa to sit in the gallery wearing her innocent clothes and cry her fake tears for the court record. I wanted them to commit perjury loudly and proudly on the official public record. I wanted the judge to hear their vicious lies and feel sympathy for them before we dropped the bomb. I ordered Julian not to say a single word about Dr. Mercer. I told him to hold that card hidden in his deck until the absolute final moment. Julian slowly leaned back in his chair, a look of profound respect washing over his face. He understood exactly what I was doing. I was not just going to win the court case. I was going to let them dig their own graves, climb inside, and then I was going to bury them alive under the weight of their own arrogance. I stood up from the table and walked toward the door, completely ready for the slaughter scheduled for the next morning. Friday morning arrived with a bitter cold wind sweeping off Lake Michigan and rattling the tall windows of the Cook County Courthouse. The courthouse is a massive, imposing structure made of heavy stone and dark wood. It is a place designed to make you feel incredibly small. It is a place where lives are completely dismantled with the simple stroke of a pen. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors of courtroom number 4, with my lawyer Julian Reed walking quietly right beside me. I was wearing my dark charcoal-tailored suit. I sat down at the defense table and folded my hands together, resting them gently on the smooth wooden surface. Darius and Vanessa were already seated at the petitioner table on the other side of the center aisle. I looked at my daughter-in-law and I had to silently applaud her absolute dedication to the theatrical performance. Vanessa had completely abandoned her usual flashy designer clothes, her heavy gold jewelry, and her expensive makeup. Today she was wearing a high-necked, pristine white blouse and a simple gray skirt. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a modest, loose ponytail. She looked pale, fragile, and utterly exhausted. It was a perfectly calculated wardrobe choice designed to make her look like an innocent, terrified victim of circumstance. Darius sat right next to her wearing a soft blue sweater, looking like a broken and heartbroken son carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He kept his head bowed, looking at his hands, completely refusing to make eye contact with me. Their lawyer, a slick, expensive-looking man with a sharp haircut, stood up as the judge entered the room. Judge Miller, an older white man with a serious, weathered face, took his seat at the high bench and called the emergency guardianship hearing to order. The slick lawyer approached the center of the room. He spoke with a soft and deeply mournful tone. He told the judge that this was an incredibly tragic case. He said it was the heartbreaking story of a beloved father whose mind had been completely stolen by the rapid and unforgiving ravages of severe dementia. He pointed a sympathetic hand in my direction. He painted me as a man who used to be a strong, hard-working provider, but was now a hollow, unpredictable, and dangerous shell of a human being. The lawyer claimed that my cognitive decline had accelerated so rapidly over the last few months that I had become an immediate physical danger to myself and a terrifying burden to my loving son and daughter-in-law. He said that Darius and Vanessa had tried absolutely everything in their power to care for me at home, but my behavior had escalated into severe paranoia and violence. Then he called Vanessa to the witness stand. Vanessa walked slowly across the silent courtroom. Her shoulders were slumped and her hands were trembling visibly. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then she sat down in the wooden chair and began the absolute greatest performance of her entire life. She looked up at the judge with wide, tear-filled eyes. She said that the problem started out small, like forgetting where I put my keys or leaving the front door wide open in the middle of the freezing night. But then her voice cracked perfectly on cue. She took a crumpled tissue from her pocket and dabbed at her eyes. She said things got incredibly dark and dangerous over the last few weeks. Vanessa told the judge that I had started having severe paranoid hallucinations. She claimed that I would wake up at 2 in the morning and wander into her kitchen, smashing dishes on the floor and screaming at people who were not actually there. She cried and said I was convinced that she and Darius were trying to steal my money. She told the court that in a fit of absolute paranoid delusion, I had somehow managed to lock all of their family bank accounts just to punish them. She clutched the tissue in her hands and told the judge that she was physically terrified of me. She leaned heavily into every single ugly stereotype she could weaponize. She described me as a large, unpredictable, angry black man who had completely lost his grip on reality. She said she had to install heavy locks on her bedroom door because I would allegedly pound on the wood for hours, demanding money that did not exist. She wept openly, claiming she had to ask me to leave the house during the blizzard because I had become physically threatening and she feared for her very life. I sat at the defense table and listened to this 33-year-old woman invent an absolute monster out of thin air. She was describing a horror movie villain to a judge who was hanging on to her every single word. My face did not move a single inch. My breathing remained perfectly steady. Julian sat quietly next to me, writing meticulously on his yellow legal pad, not raising a single objection. We were letting her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. Darius kept his head down at his table, covering his face with his hands. He was playing the role of the devastated son who simply could not bear to hear the tragic truth about his father being spoken out loud in a public courtroom. When Vanessa finished her crying, the slick lawyer approached the bench again. He handed Judge Miller a thick manila folder. He announced to the courtroom that this was an official medical certificate from Dr. Gregory Mercer. He called Dr. Mercer a highly respected physician who had personally examined me. He read portions of the fake report out loud for the court record. The fake report detailed aggressive behavior, profound memory loss, and a total inability to manage my own basic life functions. The lawyer stated that Dr. Mercer had diagnosed me with acute paranoia and advanced cognitive decline. He looked directly at the judge and stated that for my own safety and the safety of the general public, I needed to be instantly remanded to a secure psychiatric memory care facility. He argued that if I was allowed to walk out of the courthouse today, I would likely wander into traffic or severely injure a member of my own family. He specifically requested that Darius be granted immediate emergency control over my finances and my holding company Blue Oak LLC to protect my assets from my own destructive behavior. Judge Miller looked down at the paperwork and nodded slowly. A look of deep, profound sympathy washed over his face. He looked at Vanessa and offered her a comforting, gentle smile. The trap was closing flawlessly around me. The atmosphere in the courtroom was incredibly heavy and suffocating. Anyone sitting in the wooden benches of the gallery would look at me and see a tragic, broken menace who needed to be locked away behind heavy steel doors for the public good. The narrative was perfectly constructed. The evidence seemed entirely overwhelming. The grieving daughter-in-law, the heartbroken son, the official medical diagnosis. The slick lawyer rested his case. He turned to the judge and pleaded with the court to grant immediate emergency guardianship to Darius Montgomery. He said that delaying this decision would result in a catastrophic and unavoidable tragedy. It looked like I was completely finished. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at me from his high wooden bench. His expression was full of pity, the absolute worst kind of pity. The kind of pity that strips a man of his fundamental human dignity and turns him into a problem that needs to be permanently hidden away from society. Judge Miller reached out his hand and wrapped his fingers around the wooden handle of his gavel. He took a deep breath, ready to deliver his ruling. He was about to sign away my freedom, my mind, and my entire life. He was about to hand my multi-million-dollar empire over to a son who had thrown me into the snow. I turned my head slightly and looked at Julian. Julian looked back at me. He did not look worried. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a man holding a lit match over an ocean of gasoline. The theatrical performance was officially over. It was time to burn their entire world to the ground. Judge Miller's hand hovered in the air. His fingers were wrapped tightly around the wooden handle of the gavel. He opened his mouth to deliver the final ruling that would strip away my freedom and hand my life over to my son. But before the wood could strike the sounding block, Julian Reed stood up. He did not rush. He buttoned the center button of his expensive tailored suit jacket. He picked up a thick stack of folders from our defense table and walked calmly to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," Julian began, his voice echoing clearly and powerfully across the large, silent room. "What we have just witnessed from the petitioners is indeed a profound tragedy. But the tragedy is not my client declining mental state. The absolute tragedy is the staggering level of greed, perjury, and elder abuse sitting right across this aisle." The slick opposing lawyer jumped to his feet immediately, shouting an objection. He claimed Julian was making baseless, inflammatory attacks against a grieving family. Judge Miller raised his hand and ordered the lawyer to sit down. He looked down at Julian, his eyes narrowing slightly. He warned my lawyer that he better have substantial, undeniable proof to back up those incredibly heavy accusations. Julian smiled. It was a cold, sharp, predatory smile. He approached the bench and handed Judge Miller 3 heavily sealed, notarized envelopes. "Your Honor," Julian said, his voice dripping with professional confidence, "the petitioners have presented a single highly questionable medical certificate from a doctor who operates out of a cheap strip mall clinic. In response, I present to this court 3 comprehensive independent psychiatric and neurological evaluations. These were conducted over the last 48 hours by the heads of neuroscience and psychiatry at 3 of the most prestigious medical university hospitals in the country." Judge Miller broke the seals. The courtroom was dead silent as he read the first page, then the second, and then the third. He looked up, his expression shifting from pity to profound confusion. "These evaluations," Julian continued, "clearly and unequivocally state that Clarence Montgomery is in perfect cognitive health. He possesses superior mental acuity, flawless memory retention, and 0 signs of paranoia or dementia. He is entirely capable of managing his own life and his own extensive financial portfolio." The medical document submitted by the petitioners is not just medically inaccurate, it is a completely fabricated piece of fiction. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have submitted a background check showing that their expert doctor, Gregory Mercer, is currently under active federal investigation by the Drug Enforcement Administration for falsifying medical records in exchange for cash bribes. The color instantly drained from Vanessa's face. She looked at Darius with wide, terrified eyes. Her perfectly calculated innocent victim routine began to crack. Their slick lawyer began frantically flipping through his own paperwork, suddenly realizing his clients had lied to him and led him into a professional slaughterhouse. Judge Miller looked up from the documents. The soft, sympathetic pity he had shown Vanessa was completely gone. It was replaced by the hard, furious glare of a man who realized he was being used as a pawn to commit a crime. Julian did not give them a single second to recover. You might ask yourself, Your Honor, why a son and a daughter-in-law would construct such a vicious, elaborate lie, Julian said, pacing slowly in front of the petitioner table. The answer is incredibly simple. It is the oldest motive in human history. Pure, unadulterated greed and a desperate attempt to cover up their own federal crimes. Julian pulled a small digital audio player from his pocket and placed it on the evidence podium. He requested permission to enter the audio recordings into the official court record, noting that Illinois law permits the admission of evidence when a crime of extortion is being committed. The slick lawyer jumped up again, sweating profusely, babbling about privacy and inadmissible evidence. Judge Miller slammed his wooden gavel down with a sharp, explosive crack. He ordered the lawyer to sit down and remain completely silent, or he would be held in criminal contempt of court. The judge leaned forward and told Julian to play the recording immediately. Julian pressed the play button. The audio was crystal clear, echoing off the marble walls of the courtroom. The voice of Richard Vanessa' arrogant father filled the room. The entire gallery heard him threaten me in my own penthouse. They heard him say, "I just wrote you a check for $50,000. You are going to take that money right now. You are going to drop this ridiculous federal fraud complaint, and you are going to tell them to release the $1.2 million to my daughter immediately. Fight us, and I will personally make sure a judge declares you mentally incompetent and locks you in a state-run psychiatric facility for the rest of your miserable life." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom gallery. Vanessa covered her mouth with her trembling hands. She was shaking violently, her pristine white blouse suddenly looking like a prison uniform. Sitting in the second row of the gallery, Richard and Diane turned absolute chalk white. Richard looked around the room, his chest heaving with panic as the eyes of every single person in the courtroom turned toward him. The wealthy, arrogant country club executive realized he had just been caught committing federal extortion on the public record. Without waiting for the judge to speak, Richard grabbed Diane's arm, pulled her out of her seat, and literally sprinted toward the heavy wooden doors. They pushed through the exit, fleeing the courthouse like the pathetic cowards they truly were, abandoning their daughter to face the fire alone. But Julian was still not finished. He was ready to deliver the final lethal blow. "Your Honor," Julian announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs in the gallery. "The petitioners froze my client bank accounts and filed this fraudulent medical petition because they are terrified. They are terrified because my client recently discovered the foundational crime of their entire financial existence." Julian pulled a thick legal folder from his briefcase and slapped it down onto the podium. He pulled out a copy of the quitclaim deed. 2 years ago, Julian explained Darius Montgomery coerced his father into transferring the deed of their family home to avoid estate taxes. But the home was jointly owned by my client and his late wife, Beatrice Montgomery. In order to bypass the legal probate process and quickly steal the equity, Darius forged his own mother's signature on the transfer document. He paid a corrupt notary to stamp it. He thought he got away with it. But a few days ago, Darius sold that stolen house to a corporate buyer. When the $1.2 million wire transfer hit his account, the bank fraud division flagged the transaction. They discovered that Beatrice Montgomery had been deceased for 24 months before she allegedly signed that document. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and completely suffocating. You could hear a pin drop. Darius looked like a corpse. He was slouched so far down in his chair it looked like his spine had completely dissolved. He was staring blankly at the wooden table, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He had just been exposed for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny in front of a sitting judge. Vanessa was no longer pretending to cry. She was staring at Darius with a look of pure, unmasked horror. The flawless, innocent victim routine had been entirely incinerated. Everyone in that room saw exactly what they were, a pair of ruthless, manipulative parasites who were willing to destroy an innocent man's life to pay off their luxury debts. Their slick lawyer was already packing his briefcase. He knew his career was in severe jeopardy just for representing them. He completely distanced himself from his client, sliding his chair away from Darius, as if the man were suddenly highly contagious. Judge Miller sat at the high bench, his face practically vibrating with absolute rage. He looked down at Darius and Vanessa with a disgust so profound it was palpable in the air. "In my 30 years sitting on this bench," Judge Miller said, his voice trembling with furious authority, "I have never witnessed a more vile, calculated, and deeply disturbing abuse of the judicial system. You came into my courtroom, you swore an oath on a Bible, and you attempted to use the power of the state to kidnap, drug, and rob an innocent elder. You attempted to use me as your personal executioner to cover up your own financial crimes. Judge Miller slammed his gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. This petition for emergency guardianship is immediately and permanently dismissed with extreme prejudice, the judge roared. But he was not finished. He pointed a stern, shaking finger directly at Darius. I am formally referring this matter to the State Attorney General and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, right this second. The judge continued, his voice echoing like thunder. I am ordering the United States Marshals to initiate an immediate criminal investigation into Darius Montgomery and Vanessa Montgomery for perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and the forgery of federal real estate documents. You will not leave this building without speaking to federal agents. Darius buried his face in his hands and let out a loud, agonizing sob. It was not a fake sob this time. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire life was completely over. He was going to prison. Vanessa stared blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of her situation. I stood up from the defense table. I buttoned my tailored suit jacket. I did not look at my son. I did not look at his wife. They were ghosts to me now, nothing but a bad memory left behind in the dirt. Julian patted me on the shoulder, a look of profound respect on his face. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The people in the gallery parted for me, watching me with awe and absolute silence. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bright, echoing hallway of the courthouse. I took a deep breath of the cool air. The legal ambush was destroyed. My freedom was secured. But the war was not entirely over yet. Tomorrow was the grand charity gala for Vanessa Spa, and tomorrow I was going to deliver the final devastating blow in front of her entire high society world. You would think that standing in a federal courtroom listening to a judge order a criminal investigation into your entire life would be the absolute end of the road. You would think the sheer terror of facing the United States Marshals would make a person surrender. But you cannot underestimate the absolute blinding delusion of an entitled narcissist. After the devastating hearing on Friday morning, Darius and Vanessa were detained in a holding room at the courthouse. They were aggressively questioned by federal agents for 4 grueling hours. But the federal government does not move at the speed of a television drama. They build airtight, methodical cases. Because Darius had not technically fled the state and the grand jury indictment for bank fraud and forgery would take at least a few weeks to officially process, they were temporarily released pending further investigation. Darius walked out of that courthouse completely broken. He was a walking ghost, a man who finally realized he was destined for a federal prison cell. But Vanessa saw a loophole. Her brain completely rejected the reality of her impending destruction. To Vanessa, the fact that she was not sleeping in a jail cell that night meant she still had a chance to win. She convinced herself that if she could just find enough cash to pay off the commercial debts, the federal government would magically drop the charges. It was a pathetic, childish understanding of the law, but it was all she had left. Instead of hiring a criminal defense attorney and preparing for her inevitable ruin, she decided to double down on her fake, luxury lifestyle. The very next evening, Saturday night, was the scheduled date for her highly anticipated VIP fundraising gala for her boutique wellness spa chain. She had spent months planning this extravagant event, inviting the wealthiest, most elite members of Chicago high society. She was going to use this glamorous party to court new investors, desperately hoping to hook a massive financial whale to bail out her sinking ship. She actually believed she could smile, drink champagne, and charm her way out of federal tax evasion and real estate fraud. I knew all of this because Kendra, the spa manager who had bravely handed me the evidence of Vanessa financial crimes, called me on my private line early Saturday morning. Kendra told me that Vanessa had stormed into the spa on Friday evening acting completely manic and unhinged. Vanessa was screaming at the staff to polish the imported marble floors and arrange the expensive floral centerpieces. Kendra said Vanessa was telling everyone that the courthouse disaster was just a minor misunderstanding caused by a jealous, senile father-in-law. She told her employees that tonight Gala was going to secure millions of dollars in new venture capital. She was going to stand on a stage, pitch her fraudulent business to a room full of millionaires, and completely ignore the fact that the FBI was currently tearing through her corporate tax records. I sat in the quiet luxury of my penthouse listening to Kendra describe the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of my daughter-in-law. I thanked Kendra, told her to take the evening off, and promised her that the nightmare she had been living was almost over. I hung up the phone and walked over to my heavy mahogany desk. It was time to pull the final thread that would unravel Vanessa's entire existence. I picked up the sleek silver phone and dialed a private number. It was the direct line to the chief executive officer of Ironclad Holdings. Ironclad Holdings is one of the most ruthless, aggressive commercial real estate conglomerates in the state of Illinois. They own dozens of premium high-rise retail spaces in the financial district. They are also the exact corporate entity that holds the commercial lease for Vanessa Boutique Wellness Spa. And they are the entity holding the massive $1.5 million debt she used to build her fake empire. The CEO, a sharp, brilliant man named Victor, answered the phone immediately. "Victor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and low, "I need you to print out the commercial lease agreement for the wellness spa on Michigan Avenue. I need the default clauses highlighted, and I need the official eviction notices legally drafted and signed by you. I also want the formal notice of immediate loan recall prepared for presentation." Victor did not ask any questions. He knows exactly who really owns the controlling shares of Ironclad Holdings. He just asked when I needed the paperwork ready to go. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the clear, freezing Chicago skyline. The city was glowing with thousands of lights, completely unaware of the storm I was about to unleash. "Have the documents ready by 7 o'clock tonight," I told him. "Get your best tailored suit on, Victor. We are going to a very exclusive party tonight." I ended the call and walked down the long gallery-style hallway of my penthouse to my master bedroom. For 35 years, I had deliberately hidden my true financial power. I had worn faded puffer jackets, driven a rusted Chevy truck, and let the arrogant elites of this city look right past me. I had allowed my son to treat me like a burden because I wanted to see the true content of his character. I had given them every opportunity to be decent human beings. I had tested their hearts, and they had failed in the most spectacular, cruel way possible. The tired, quiet man in the faded jacket was gone. He died the night they threw him out into a Category 3 blizzard and handed him a crumpled $100 bill. I opened the heavy glass doors of my expansive wardrobe. I bypassed the casual clothes and reached for the garments I reserved for absolute corporate warfare. I pulled out a bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit. The fabric was immaculate cut with absolute precision, designed to command respect the second you walk into a room. I put on a crisp, perfectly pressed white silk blend dress shirt and tied a dark silver silk tie around my collar. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and fastened a solid platinum Patek Philippe watch around my wrist. The timepiece alone was worth more than the luxury vehicles Darius and Vanessa leased to look wealthy. I slipped my feet into polished black Italian leather Oxfords that shone like dark glass. I looked at my reflection in the quiet room. The slumping posture of a defeated old man was entirely gone. I stood tall, my shoulders broad and square. The years of hard labor and quiet observation had hardened into something unbreakable. I looked exactly like what I was, a kingmaker, a hidden titan of Chicago commercial real estate, a man who could end a multi-million-dollar business with a single quiet phone call. Tonight, Vanessa was expecting to dazzle the elites. She was expecting to secure her future and save her fraudulent empire with cheap champagne and fake smiles. She thought she had outsmarted the law, outsmarted her husband, and outsmarted me. I walked out of my bedroom and headed for the private elevator. I was going to walk right through her front doors. I was going to step onto her red carpet, look her directly in the eye, and bring her artificial world crashing down so violently that she would never, ever recover. The time for hiding was over. The predator was stepping out into the light. The freezing wind whipping off Lake Michigan did nothing to cool the fire burning inside my chest. My private driver pulled the heavy black luxury sedan up to the curb on Michigan Avenue. The street outside Vanessa Boutique Wellness Spa was lined with expensive imported sports cars and massive luxury SUVs. Valets in thick winter coats were running back and forth, opening doors for the wealthy elites of Chicago high society. Tonight was the grand VIP fundraising gala. The event Vanessa desperately hoped would save her from the federal prison cell waiting for her. I sat in the back of the spacious vehicle looking through the tinted glass. Next to me sat Victor, the chief executive officer of Ironclad Holdings. He was holding a sleek black leather portfolio resting on his lap. Inside that portfolio were the legal documents that were about to end my daughter-in-law's entire existence. Victor looked at me and gave a single firm nod. It was time. The driver opened my door. I stepped out onto the icy pavement. I was not wearing the faded, heavy puffer jacket they were used to seeing. I was wearing a bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit tailored to absolute perfection. The fabric was immaculate and heavy, insulating me against the biting cold. My posture was perfectly straight. I did not look like the tired 72-year-old black man they threw into a blizzard just 4 days ago. I looked like the chairman of the board. I looked like the man who owned the very street they were parking on. We walked up to the grand glass entrance of the spa. 2 large security guards in cheap black suits were standing by a velvet rope checking names on a digital tablet. They looked up as Victor and I approached. One of them stepped forward, ready to ask for our invitations. But then he recognized Victor. Every high-end security firm in the financial district knows the face of the man who manages the ironclad commercial properties. The guard swallowed hard, took a quick step back, and unclipped the velvet rope without saying a single word. True power does not wait in line. True power simply arrives and the world gets out of its way. I walked through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the massive reception area of the wellness spa. The room was an absolute monument to financial vanity and unearned privilege. The air smelled of expensive eucalyptus and imported essential oils. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high exposed ceilings, casting a warm, flattering light over the imported Italian marble floors. Waiters in crisp white shirts floated through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne and tiny, pretentious appetizers. The room was packed tightly with the exact kind of people Vanessa worshipped. Wealthy, entitled, predominantly white suburban elites who spent their weekends comparing country club memberships and gossiping about the people who served them. I stood near the back of the room by the coat check, completely unnoticed in the sea of designer dresses and expensive cologne. Victor stood quietly right beside me, blending into the shadows. And then I heard her. Vanessa's voice echoed through the overhead surround sound system. She was standing on a slightly raised platform at the far end of the room, bathed in a warm spotlight. She was holding a microphone, wearing a sleek, incredibly expensive-looking emerald green evening gown. Her hair was perfectly styled and her makeup was flawless. She looked like a queen holding court. Darius stood obediently a few steps behind her. He was wearing a fitted tuxedo, but he did not look confident. He looked sick. He looked like a man who knew the federal authorities were currently building a massive criminal case against him. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting nervously around the room. But Vanessa was completely in her element. She had entirely blocked out the reality of the courthouse disaster. I listened to the words coming out of my daughter-in-law's mouth, and the sheer audacity of her lies was almost breathtaking. I look around this beautiful room tonight, Vanessa projected into the microphone, her voice dripping with fake humility and practiced emotion. And I am just so overwhelmed with gratitude. Building this flagship wellness empire was the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire life. There were so many sleepless nights, so many sacrifices, so many moments where I thought I could not push any harder. She paused, placing a hand over her heart, taking a deep theatrical breath. But I did it, she continued, her voice rising with dramatic triumph. I built this beautiful vision from the ground up entirely on my own. I did not have handouts. I did not have a safety net. As a female founder in a cutthroat city, I had to fight for every single inch of space I occupy. I relied on my own grit, my own determination, and my own relentless work ethic to make this dream a reality. I am a self-made woman, and tonight we celebrate the power of independent success. I stood by the coat check and listened to her claim the title of a self-made woman, a woman who was currently drowning in $1.5 million of predatory commercial debt, a woman who was actively stealing the income tax withholdings of her own minimum wage massage therapists, a woman who had forced her husband to forge my dead wife's signature just to steal my home. And here she was, holding a glass of champagne, soaking up the applause of her wealthy friends, pretending she was an independent, highly successful entrepreneur. It was an absolute masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. The crowd erupted into polite applause. The wealthy investors raised their crystal glasses to toast her fake struggles. I decided I had heard enough of her fairy tale. I stepped out of the shadows at the back of the room. I walked directly down the center aisle, moving slowly, deliberately, with the heavy, unyielding presence of a man who owned the very ground he was walking on. Victor followed a few steps behind me, holding the black portfolio. My polished leather Oxfords clicked sharply against the marble floor. The crowd was dense, but as I moved forward, people instinctively began to part. They looked at my tailored suit, They looked at the heavy platinum watch gleaming on my wrist, and they stepped aside. A murmur started to ripple through the room. The polite applause for Vanessa's speech slowly died out. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped completely. A heavy, incredibly awkward silence began to spread from the back of the room all the way to the front stage. Vanessa noticed the sudden shift in the room energy. She stopped talking mid-sentence. She lowered the microphone and peered into the crowd, her brow furrowing as she tried to see what was causing the distraction. And then her eyes locked onto me. I stopped walking about 20 feet away from the stage. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting casually by my sides. I looked directly up at her. For a split second, I saw the genuine flash of absolute panic in her eyes. She recognized my face, but her brain could not process what she was seeing. She was expecting the broken-down old black man in the faded puffer jacket who she had thrown into the freezing snow. She was expecting the confused elderly victim she had cried about on social media. She was not expecting a man radiating immense wealth and absolute authority. Behind her on the stage, Darius finally snapped out of his nervous trance. He realized what was happening, and his face turned an ugly shade of dark red. He was furious, embarrassed, and completely desperate to regain control of the situation before I ruined their public relations event. The fear of federal prison was temporarily overridden by his pathetic need to protect his fragile ego in front of the Chicago elites. Darius marched down the steps of the stage and walked aggressively toward me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He stopped just inches from my face, trying to use his physical size and his youth to intimidate me. "What the hell are you doing here?" Darius hissed, keeping his voice low but filled with absolute venom. "Are you completely insane? After everything that happened in court yesterday, you actually show up here dressed in a rental suit to try and ruin my wife's biggest night." He turned around and looked at the two large security guards standing near the entrance. "Security," Darius shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room. "Get over here right now. Grab this man and throw him out onto the street. He is trespassing. He is a crazy old man and he is harassing my wife. Call the police and get him out of my building." The security guards took a step forward, but then they saw Victor standing right behind me. Victor raised a single hand and shook his head once. The guards instantly froze completely, ignoring Darius' orders. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I looked at the pathetic, sweating man standing in front of me. The son who had tried to steal my freedom and auction off my life. He thought he was giving orders. He thought he was the man in charge. He had absolutely no idea that the guillotine was already falling. I let a cold, terrifying smile slowly spread across my face as I prepared to end his world. Darius stood there with his arm outstretched, pointing a trembling finger at the security guards. He screamed at them again, demanding they do their jobs and physically throw me out into the freezing Chicago night. He thought his rented tuxedo and his loud voice gave him authority. But the two large men by the door did not even flinch. They kept their hands folded neatly in front of them, staring straight ahead, completely ignoring my son. Darius looked around the silent room, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He could not understand why his commands were bouncing off the walls like meaningless echoes. He took a threatening step toward me, raising his hands as if he was going to try and push me out himself. But before he could even close the distance, Victor stepped smoothly out from behind me. Victor is the chief executive officer of Ironclad Holdings. He is a man who manages billions of dollars in commercial real estate across the state of Illinois. He does not raise his voice. He does not sweat. He just moves with the heavy, undeniable weight of a man who controls the board. Victor walked right past my son, not even sparing him a single glance. He walked down the center aisle of the room, ascending the short flight of stairs to the brightly lit stage. Vanessa was still standing there, clutching the microphone. When she saw Victor approaching, her eyes lit up with a sudden desperate hope. She recognized him from the countless meetings where she had begged for the commercial lease and the $1.5 million loan. Her narcissistic brain immediately jumped to the most delusional conclusion possible. She actually thought Victor was walking up to the stage to publicly endorse her wellness spa. She thought the CEO of her lending firm had come to this gala to announce a massive new investment in front of Chicago elite society. She put on her absolute best camera-ready smile. She took a step toward Victor, extending her free hand to welcome him. Victor did not shake her hand. He did not smile back. He simply reached out his hand and firmly took the microphone right out of her grip. Vanessa froze, her hand still suspended awkwardly in the air. The smile melted off her face, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Victor turned his back on her, and faced the sea of wealthy investors, socialites, and local politicians filling the room. He tapped the microphone once. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent spa. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Victor said, his voice echoing smoothly and powerfully across the imported marble floors. "I apologize for the sudden interruption to your champagne and caviar. My name is Victor Sterling. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Ironclad Holdings. As many of the investors in this room already know, Ironclad Holdings is the primary commercial landlord for this entire premium retail block. We own the deed to the ground you are currently standing on. We are also the exclusive venture capital firm holding the $1.5 million debt structure that paid for every single crystal chandelier, massage table, and marble tile you see in this room today." A low murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. The wealthy elites nodded, appreciating the presence of a real corporate heavyweight. Vanessa tried to nod along with them, pretending this was all part of the planned evening schedule. But Victor was not there to celebrate her. He was there to execute her. "I was standing in the back of the room a moment ago," Victor continued, his tone turning completely cold and clinical. "And I listened to the proprietor of this establishment give a very moving speech. I heard her tell all of you that she is a self-made woman. I heard her claim that she built this luxury wellness empire from the ground up with absolutely no handouts, no safety net, and no silent benefactors." Victor slowly turned his head and looked directly at Vanessa. She physically shrank back from his gaze. "That is a complete and absolute fabrication," Victor announced, his voice dropping to a lethal register. "This business is not a testament to independent female entrepreneurship. This business exists solely because of the extraordinary grace and the direct financial backing of one single private investor, a man who prefers to operate in the shadows but who personally approved the high-risk loan that allowed this vanity project to open its doors." The room grew so incredibly quiet you could hear the soft hum of the climate control system. Nobody dared to take a sip of their drinks. The socialites stopped whispering. The photographers lowered their cameras. Victor stepped to the edge of the stage and extended his arm respectfully, pointing directly at me. I was still standing perfectly still in the center aisle, my hands resting casually by my sides, wearing my bespoke midnight blue suit. "Please allow me to formally introduce the founder, the majority shareholder, and the sole private financial backer of Ironclad Holdings," Victor projected loudly. "Mr. Clarence Montgomery." The silence that followed that sentence was heavier than gravity. It was the sound of an entire room experiencing a collective paralyzing state of shock. It took exactly 3 seconds for the reality of those words to fully register in the minds of the people in that room. And when it did, the reaction was absolute devastating perfection. Jaws literally dropped. A woman in the front row gasped so sharply she spilled her champagne down the front of her expensive silk dress. The local politicians stared at me with their eyes wide open, instantly realizing they were standing in the presence of a hidden real estate titan. The poor, senile old black man in the faded puffer jacket was a myth. The confused, angry elder they had seen crying on viral internet videos was a complete illusion. The man standing before them was the apex predator of the Chicago commercial real estate market. But the absolute best reaction, the single most beautiful display of human devastation, belonged to my son and his wife. Darius looked like a man who had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. His knees buckled slightly. He staggered backward, bumping hard into a velvet rope stanchion. His brain was completely short-circuiting. He had spent his entire adult life trying to look rich, leasing cars he could not afford, and drowning in debt just to impress the people in this room. He had looked down on his own father because I drove a rusted Chevy truck. He had thrown me out into a Category 3 blizzard to steal $1 million. And now he was staring at the undeniable truth. His father was not a retired city worker surviving on a pension. His father was a multi-millionaire who owned the very building he was standing in. Vanessa's reaction was even worse. The blood drained from her face so completely that her skin looked like translucent wax. Her perfectly contoured makeup could not hide the sheer, unmasked horror twisting her features. She clutched the side of the wooden podium to keep from collapsing onto the floor. She realized the catastrophic magnitude of her situation in real time. The old man she had just publicly humiliated, the man she had thrown garbage bags at, the man she had falsely accused of domestic violence to millions of strangers on the internet, was her actual landlord. He was the man holding 100% of her massive commercial debt. I began to walk forward. I moved with slow, deliberate purpose. The crowd of wealthy elites parted for me like the Red Sea. They stepped back, shrinking away from my path, looking at me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. They knew they were watching a public execution. I stopped at the base of the stage, looking up at the woman who had tried to destroy my life. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who controlled every single oxygen molecule in the room. "You wanted everyone to know what a successful self-made woman looks like, Vanessa," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the dead silence. "Let us talk about the reality of your success. You do not own this studio, I own this studio. You do not hold the lease to this commercial property. My firm owns the deed to this entire city block. You are standing on my imported marble floors. You are breathing my air conditioning. And you owe my company $1.5 million in high-yield predatory debt." She was hyperventilating on the stage. She could not speak. She could not even form a coherent thought. She just shook her head back and forth as thick, dark tears of absolute terror ruined her perfectly styled face. "You thought I was just a tired old man who did not understand modern finance?" I continued, tossing her own condescending words right back at her. "You thought you could throw me out into a blizzard, freeze my accounts, and run to the internet to play the victim. You thought you were dealing with a helpless, lonely burden." I looked over at my son, who was leaning against the wall, sweating profusely and shaking like a leaf in the wind. "You wanted to build a luxury empire on the back of my sacrifices," I said, my eyes locking onto theirs with absolutely zero mercy. "But you forgot the most important rule of surviving in this city. You never bite the hand that quietly owns the cage you live in. The old man you tried to bury alive just woke up, and he is here to collect every single thing you owe him." The silence inside the luxurious wellness spa was so absolute that it felt like the air had been sucked completely out of the room. Hundreds of Chicago's wealthiest elites, the very people Vanessa had invited to witness her grand triumph, were completely paralyzed. They were staring at me, the man they had dismissed as a background character, now standing before them as the sole owner of the ground beneath their feet. I reached out my hand. Victor, the chief executive officer of Ironclad Holdings, stood beside me and calmly placed the heavy black leather portfolio into my grasp. I did not rush. I opened the portfolio with slow, deliberate precision. The soft sound of the leather unzipping echoed across the imported marble floors. I pulled out a single, crisp, white document. I held it up so the bright stage lights caught the heavy black ink. "This is a formal and immediate notice of commercial eviction, Vanessa," I announced, my voice calm but carrying the heavy weight of a judge reading a final sentence. "When my firm approved the lease for this building, we included a very specific and incredibly strict moral and ethical conduct clause. Attempting to falsely imprison an elderly man, extorting his assets, and committing perjury in a federal courtroom constitutes a catastrophic violation of those terms. Therefore, your lease is officially terminated as of this exact second. You have absolutely no legal right to occupy this space. By tomorrow morning, the locks on these glass doors will be changed, and every single expensive machine in this room will be seized as partial payment for your breach of contract." Vanessa let out a choked, agonizing sound. She stumbled backward on the stage, her high heels catching on the platform. She reached out blindly and grabbed the wooden podium just to keep her knees from giving out completely. Her flagship studio, the crown jewel of her fake success, the place she had invited the local media to admire, was being ripped away from her in real time. The wealthy investors in the audience, the people she had just been begging for money, were physically stepping back from the stage. They were looking at her not with admiration, but with profound, toxic disgust. But taking away her playground was only the first part of the execution. I reached back into the black portfolio. I did not pull out a single sheet of paper this time. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of printed spreadsheets and banking ledgers. These were the documents Kendra had given me in that freezing diner, the undeniable proof of their federal crimes. I looked at the crowd of venture capitalists and socialites. Then I looked directly at Vanessa. "You stood on this stage tonight and told these people you were a self-made woman," I said, my voice vibrating with a cold, lethal fury. "You asked them to invest in your vision, but you did not tell them how you really fund your luxury lifestyle." I raised the stack of financial documents high in the air, and then I threw them violently onto the floor. The papers scattered across the pristine Italian marble, sliding right to the feet of the wealthy guests. "You are not a successful entrepreneur, Vanessa," I declared, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. "You are a fraud. You are a criminal who is actively stealing the federal income tax withholdings from your own minimum wage employees. You are pocketing the hard-earned money of the massage therapists and the cleaners who work in this building just so you can lease your luxury vehicles and buy your designer dresses. You are washing dirty money through phantom client memberships to trick these very investors into giving you more capital. You are spending the blood, sweat, and tears of innocent working-class people to prop up a pathetic fake empire. The reaction from the crowd was explosive. The wealthy elites began murmuring loudly, pointing at the papers on the floor. A few of the prominent investors actually leaned down and picked up the spreadsheets, looking at the undeniable proof of tax evasion and money laundering. In the world of high society and venture capital, being broke is a sin, but stealing from your own investors and committing federal tax fraud is an absolute death sentence. The people who had been drinking her champagne just 10 minutes ago were now pulling out their phones, frantically texting their lawyers to completely distance themselves from her business. Vanessa was sobbing uncontrollably now. The flawless makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She was shaking her head back and forth, desperately trying to deny it, but the evidence was literally scattered at the feet of her peers. She had no defense. She had no more lies left to tell. Her reputation in Chicago was completely, permanently incinerated. Darius had been standing near the edge of the stage, frozen in absolute terror. When I threw the tax documents onto the floor, the last remaining shred of his courage completely evaporated. He realized that I knew everything. He realized that the federal government knew everything. He took a stumbling step backward, looking toward the side exit of the spa. He was actually going to run. He was going to abandon his wife and try to escape into the freezing night, but he did not even make it 3 steps. The heavy glass doors at the main entrance of the wellness spa swung open with a violent crash. The cold winter wind blew into the warm room, carrying with it the flashing red and blue lights of multiple vehicles parked illegally on Michigan Avenue. The wealthy guests gasped and parted instantly as a team of 6 men and women marched into the room. They were not local police officers. They were wearing dark windbreakers with the large yellow letters printed clearly across their backs, indicating they were federal agents. They did not stop to ask for invitations. They did not care about the expensive dresses or the crystal chandeliers. They moved with terrifying military precision, walking straight down the center aisle of the room. Leading them was a senior special agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved out of stone. He locked his eyes entirely on my son, Darius Montgomery. The special agent announced, his deep, authoritative voice cutting through the panic in the room like a machete. "You are under arrest by order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Darius let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He backed away, bumping blindly into a row of expensive Pilates machines, raising his hands in a weak gesture of surrender. "You are being charged with federal wire fraud, grand larceny, identity theft, and the forgery of federal real estate documents." The agent continued, reading the charges loud enough for the entire high society crowd to hear. "You are also being charged with conspiracy to commit tax evasion and money laundering." 2 federal agents stepped forward, grabbing Darius roughly by the arms and spinning him around. He did not fight them. He had absolutely no strength left. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the luxurious room. It was the sound of a man life officially coming to an end. Darius began to weep openly. His knees buckled and the agents had to physically hold him upright by the fabric of his rented tuxedo. He looked like a small, broken child. The arrogant man who had handed me a single $100 bill and told me to take a taxi into a blizzard was now being hauled away in chains in front of the most powerful people in the city. The VIP gala had officially transformed into a sensational federal crime scene. The guests were completely panicking, scrambling toward the exits, desperate to avoid being photographed near a federal raid. Women dropped their expensive purses. Men pushed past each other, trying to get to the valet stand. The artificial, glamorous world my son and his wife had built was burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos. I watched the federal agents march my crying, broken son toward the exit doors. I watched his arrogant wife collapse onto the stage, weeping alone in the wreckage of her studio as her wealthy friends completely abandoned her. They wanted to bury me alive. They wanted to steal my mind, my money, and my dignity. But the quiet old man they had underestimated had just leveled their entire existence without ever breaking a sweat. I looked at the faces of the investors as they scrambled toward the doors. These were people who prided themselves on being untouchable. But tonight, they learned that there is always someone bigger, always someone who holds the actual strings. And tonight that person was the 72-year-old black man they had completely ignored when he walked into the room. Darius was being dragged past me by the federal agents. As he drew near, he managed to lift his tear-stained face. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a visceral, animalistic desperation. He was hoping to find a father. He was hoping to find the man who had protected him his entire life. He opened his mouth, his lips trembling, trying to form a plea for help. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I looked back at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Chicago winter outside. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched him face the absolute consequence of his own greed. I watched him realize that the protection of his father was completely, permanently gone. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around my son's wrists echoed through the luxurious room like a final, undeniable death sentence. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles parked illegally on Michigan Avenue cast long, chaotic shadows across the imported Italian marble floors. The glamorous VIP fundraising gala had completely evaporated in a matter of seconds. The wealthy guests, the lifestyle reporters, and the local politicians had scattered toward the edges of the room, desperate to distance themselves from a federal crime scene. They pressed their backs against the expensive mirrored walls, watching the destruction unfold with morbid fascination. The only people left in the center of the massive eucalyptus-scented room were the federal agents, my managing director Victor, myself, and the two people whose entire artificial world had just violently collapsed. When a person builds their entire life on a foundation of lies, vanity, and stolen money, they do not possess the structural integrity to handle true adversity. When the walls of reality close and their polished upper-class manners disappear completely, they revert to their most primal vicious instincts. I was about to watch the final ugly destruction of my son's marriage unfold on a public stage. Vanessa was still standing on the wooden platform, surrounded by the scattered financial documents that proved her massive federal tax fraud. She looked down and saw the federal agents securing the heavy restraints on her husband. The sheer paralyzing terror in her eyes quickly mutated into something entirely different and far more sinister. It turned into a raw, venomous instinct for absolute self-preservation. She realized that she was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, and she decided to throw her own husband into the freezing water just to buy herself another breath of air. She scrambled off the wooden platform, her expensive emerald green evening gown catching under her heels and tearing loudly at the seam. She did not care about the dress anymore. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at Darius, who was already weeping softly in the iron grip of two federal agents. "Do not look at me!" Vanessa screamed at the approaching officers, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "I did not do anything wrong. I am a victim here. It was him. It was all him. He is the one who forged the signatures on those legal documents. He is the one who went into his father's accounts and stole the house. I did not know anything about a fake real estate deed. He lied to me for years. He forced me to go along with it because he was drowning in his own secret debts." Darius snapped his head up. His bloodshot eyes widened in absolute shock as he listened to his wife, the woman he had sold his very soul to impress, completely throw him into the federal fire to save her own skin. Vanessa did not stop her frantic, desperate lies. She scrambled closer to the lead federal agent, completely ignoring the husband she had sworn to love through thick and thin. "He manipulated me," she yelled, pointing violently at Darius while tears streamed down her ruined face. "He told me his father was just a useless, senile old man. He told me the money belonged to him and he was just taking his rightful inheritance early. He orchestrated the entire tax fraud scheme because he is a weak, greedy man who desperately wanted to look rich to my friends. I am just his wife. I trusted him and he deliberately ruined my entire business." The illusion of their perfect high society romance shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Stripped of their luxury leased cars, their fine dining reservations, and their unearned social superiority, they were nothing but two starving rats trapped in a sinking cage, viciously chewing each other to the bone just to survive another 5 minutes. Darius, usually a coward who avoided confrontation at all costs, finally snapped under the weight of her treachery. The sheer ultimate betrayal from the woman he worshipped pushed him completely over the edge of his fragile sanity. He lunged forward against the tight grip of the federal agents, his face contorted with a terrible mixture of profound grief and explosive rage. "You lying, greedy parasite," Darius roared, his voice cracking violently under the immense emotional strain. "You begged for this studio. You cried every single night saying you would divorce me if I did not find the money to fund your pathetic vanity project. You never loved me, you never respected me, you just loved what you thought I could steal for you to show off to your rich friends." The federal agents had seen enough of the pathetic domestic dispute. The lead agent gave a sharp nod, signaling his team to get them both out of the building immediately. Two officers grabbed Vanessa firmly by the arms. She kicked and thrashed, screaming hysterically, begging for her parents, as the cold steel handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists, too. As the agents began to drag Darius toward the heavy glass exit doors, the absolute crushing finality of the situation crashed down upon him. He was going to a federal penitentiary. He was losing his home, his wife, his freedom, and his entire future. In a last, desperate, pathetic act of survival, Darius dropped his dead weight. His knees hit the hard, imported marble floor with a heavy, agonizing thud right in front of me. He twisted his body violently and threw himself forward, ignoring the shouts of the federal agents. He reached out with his cuffed hands and grabbed the fine wool fabric of my tailored trousers. He clung to my leg like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood in a hurricane. He looked up at me, his face completely covered in sweat, snot, and tears. He was practically hyperventilating, begging me with a visceral, animalistic desperation. "Dad, please," Darius sobbed, his voice reduced to a pathetic, broken whimper. "Please, you have to stop this. You have the power to stop this right now. Tell them you gave me permission to sign the deed. Tell them it was all just a big family misunderstanding. I will do anything you want. I will work in your warehouses for the rest of my life. I will pay back every single cent I took from you. Please, Dad, I am your only son. Do not let them take me away in chains." I looked down at the weeping, broken man clinging desperately to my leg. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal sympathy. I searched the deepest corners of my soul for a single flicker of sadness or regret. But there was absolutely nothing left. The chamber of my heart that used to hold my unconditional love for him had been permanently sealed and boarded up the night he threw me out of my own home. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I was looking at a complete stranger who had tried to bury me alive for a handful of cash. I looked down into his desperate, terrified eyes. My eyes were as cold and unforgiving as the freezing blizzard night when he closed the heavy oak door on my face. I slowly and deliberately took a single step backward. The premium fabric of my trousers slipped smoothly out of his cuffed and trembling hands. He fell forward slightly, his palms hitting the empty marble floor. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute terrifying clarity, ensuring that my final words to him would echo in his mind for the rest of his miserable life. "That night when she threw my clothes out into the freezing snow, you had a choice." I said my words cutting through the chaotic noise of the room like a razor blade. "You watched her strip away my dignity. You handed me a crumpled $100 bill and you stood perfectly still. You chose to stand perfectly still and let me freeze to death." Darius let out a low, agonizing moan, shaking his head back and forth in frantic denial, knowing exactly what was coming next. So now I continued my expression, completely devoid of mercy. "It is my turn to stand perfectly still and watch the law go to work." I turned my back on him. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I did not look over my shoulder to see his reaction. I simply buttoned my bespoke Tom Ford suit jacket and gave a brief, respectful nod to Victor, who was standing quietly near the reception desk. As I walked toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the street, the sounds of their total destruction echoed loudly behind me. I heard Darius screaming my name in absolute agony, begging for a father who no longer existed. I heard Vanessa sobbing and cursing the federal agents as they dragged her across the expensive floor she used to own. The wealthy guests who had stayed behind pulled out their phones. The rapid flashing bulbs of their cameras illuminated the room, capturing every agonizing second of the public downfall. They captured the image of the two arrogant thieves being hauled away, and they captured the image of the silent titan walking away from the wreckage he had meticulously orchestrated. I pushed open the doors and stepped out into the crisp, freezing night air of Chicago. The pristine black luxury sedan was waiting for me at the curb with the engine running and the heat turned up. The driver opened the rear door for me. I slid into the quiet plush leather interior, leaving the screaming rats securely locked inside the federal cage they had so greedily built for themselves. 6 months have passed since the flashing lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the snowy streets of Michigan Avenue. The brutal, freezing winter of Chicago has finally melted away, giving way to a warm, breathing summer. And just like the changing of the seasons, the landscape of my entire life has been completely reborn. The justice system is often slow, but when you hand federal prosecutors a silver platter loaded with digital audio confessions, forged real estate documents, and a massive paper trail of stolen income tax withholdings, the wheels turn with absolute and devastating efficiency. The storm I unleashed that night did not just break their foundation, it completely wiped them off the map. Darius did not even try to fight the charges in court. Once his expensive defense attorney saw the mountain of evidence Julian Reed had compiled, and once they realized the corrupt doctor had already flipped on them to save his own medical license, my son took a plea deal. He is currently sitting in a federal correctional facility just outside of the state, serving a mandatory 5-year sentence for wire fraud, grand larceny, and forgery. The tailored tuxedos and the expensive leased luxury cars are entirely gone, replaced by a standard-issue khaki uniform and a tiny concrete cell. Federal prison is not kind to soft, entitled men who try to play the victim. He has tried to write me several letters since he was incarcerated. They arrive at Julian office, thick envelopes filled with pathetic apologies and desperate regrets. I do not open them. I place them in a locked drawer. He made his choices, and now he has to sit in a cell and live with the deafening echo of his own consequences. The boy I raised is gone, and the criminal who took his place is exactly where he belongs. Vanessa faced a destruction that was far worse than a prison sentence for someone with her specific kind of malignant vanity. She managed to avoid serving hard time behind bars by instantly turning state evidence against my son, cooperating fully with the federal investigators to save her own skin. She was handed a strict sentence of 5 years on federal probation, but her life as she knew it was completely obliterated when Ironclad Holdings initiated the immediate recall of her $1.5 million commercial loan. The financial avalanche was absolute. Because she and Darius had fraudulently used my property as collateral, the massive debt defaulted entirely onto her personally. The bankruptcy courts stripped her bare. They seized the luxury cars, leaving her to navigate the city on public transportation. They emptied the bank accounts. They even forced the public liquidation of her expensive designer wardrobe and her jewelry just to satisfy the crushing legal fees and the outstanding creditor judgments. She lost the wellness spa, she lost the penthouse apartment they were renting, and most importantly to her, she lost her completely fabricated social standing. The wealthy friends who used to drink champagne with her at the gala deleted her number the moment the scandal hit the local news. Today, Vanessa is living back in the dark, unfinished basement of her parents' house. But it is not a happy family reunion. Richard and Diane, the arrogant people who once marched into my penthouse and threatened to destroy me, are now complete social pariahs. The elite circles they fought so hard to impress have completely shunned them. And worse, the massive federal spotlight Vanessa brought onto their family triggered a deep forensic audit by the Internal Revenue Service. Richard and Diane are currently under active investigation for their own corporate tax anomalies. Their bank accounts are frozen and they are drowning in legal fees. Vanessa is trapped in a cold basement filled with resentment, forced to work a minimum-wage administrative job just to help pay off the legal debts she accumulated. She wanted to be a high society queen, but her greed turned her into a prisoner of her own making. While their fake plastic world completely collapsed, my world finally found a sense of profound, unbroken peace. The commercial real estate transaction for the house in Hyde Park was officially reversed by the federal courts. The deed to the 4-bedroom brick colonial, the house I bought 40 years ago, was returned to my name, but I did not want to live there anymore. The memories of my late wife Beatrice were beautiful, but the memory of being thrown off that porch into a blizzard was a stain I needed to wash away. I realized very quickly that the vast empire I had built over 35 years needed a new purpose. Hoarding wealth is a hollow victory if it does not leave the world a little better than you found it. So I took that old house in Hyde Park and completely gutted the interior. I hired the best contractors in Chicago and transformed the property into a state-of-the-art vocational training center for young, underprivileged African-American men and women. I named it the Beatrice Foundation in honor of the woman who taught me the true meaning of hard work and compassion. We do not just offer handouts. We offer a tangible future. We converted the living room into a computer lab and the bedrooms into drafting studios. We bring in master electricians, plumbers, architects, and financial advisors to teach these young kids actual valuable skills. We teach them financial literacy, real estate acquisition, and how to build generational wealth without losing their integrity. We focus on the kids who have the drive and the intellect to succeed, but lack the financial safety net to get their foot in the door. I wanted to build a ladder for the youth who are currently standing exactly where Beatrice and I stood 50 years ago. Kendra, the brave woman who handed me the financial ledgers that brought down Vanessa Spa, is now the fully salaried executive director of the foundation. She finally has the respect and the authority she always deserved. Tonight, the penthouse is perfectly quiet. I am sitting in my favorite leather chair by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city of Chicago glow against the dark night sky. I am holding a warm mug of herbal tea, letting the steam rise and soothe my chest. I look down at the sprawling, glittering lights of the financial district. I look at the commercial high-rises in the distance, knowing that my name is quietly printed on the deeds of several of those massive buildings. I look at the streets where I used to work long, grueling shifts in the freezing cold. I survived the ultimate betrayal of my own flesh and blood. I survived the insidious, arrogant greed of a society that tried to write me off as a weak, disposable old man. I did not just survive it, I completely conquered it. I reclaimed my name, I protected my true legacy, and I secured the future for dozens of young kids who actually deserve a chance at the American dream. The war is officially over and the storm has finally passed. They assume that because you are old and quiet, you are weak. They believe that freezing you out in the storm will make you beg for warmth. But they forget that some of us were forged in the cold. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to strip away your dignity, and age does not mean you surrender your power. When you build a life with your own bare hands, you hold the absolute right to tear down any parasite trying to feed off your foundation. True power does not make noise. It simply waits, watches, and legally reclaims what it owns. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about finding your strength and taking back your power. Thank you for listening, and remember to always protect your foundation.